Hey there, night owls. Tonight we're doing the whole Bible in one sitting, every page cover to cover, 66 books, over 1,000 chapters, 40 plus writers across 1,500 years, all snapping together into one giant story. Sounds impossible to follow? By the end, it'll sit in your head like a movie you've already watched 100 times. Here's the trick. I'm handing you a map. We chase 3 characters from the first line to the last: God, His people, and His land. And to lock every twist into your memory, each big section gets its own Australian animal. Yes, koalas and kangaroos are about to teach you scripture. Don't ask why it works. It just does. So here's the dare. Can you make it to the end? Ancient world first, then 400 years of dead silence, then everything flips. Smash that like button if you're in, and before we launch, drop a comment telling me exactly where on the planet you're watching from and what time it is right now. Lights down. Volume up. Let's roll. Before we crack open that famous first page, we need to take a slow walk around the set, because a story this enormous makes a whole lot more sense once you know where it happens, when it happens, and how a stack of 66 separate books somehow ended up telling one connected tale. Think of this as the establishing shot in a film, the wide sweep across the landscape before the camera zooms in on anyone's face. Skip it, and you'll spend the next few hours quietly confused about which desert we're standing in and why everyone keeps walking to Egypt. Sit through it, and everything that follows snaps into place like it was designed that way, which, mild spoiler, it more or less was. Let's begin with the map, because in this story geography is basically destiny, and the entire drama plays out on a surprisingly narrow strip of the ancient world. Picture the region we now call the Middle East, and drop your finger on 3 big neighbourhoods. First there's Mesopotamia, a name that translates to roughly the land between the rivers, because ancient naming committees were nothing if not painfully literal. Those rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the whole area sits inside modern-day Iraq. This is where the story opens and where several major characters get their start, so file it away. Second, there's Egypt, stretched out along the Nile like a green ribbon dropped across a sea of sand, a civilization so obsessed with the afterlife that they spent centuries perfecting the art of not letting their kings decompose. A significant chunk of our tale happens here, usually under circumstances nobody signed up for. And third, sitting right in the middle like a doormat between the great powers, there's a small stretch of land known back then as Canaan, later as Israel. It's the land bridge everyone had to cross to get anywhere important, which meant it got trampled by every passing army for about 2,000 years. Real estate agents would call it a high-traffic location. Everyone else called it a nightmare to defend. Later in the story, a 4th power muscles into the frame, and that's Rome, the empire that eventually paved roads across the whole known world and taxed everyone standing on them. But Rome doesn't show up until the very end of the setup, so for now just remember it's coming, the way you remember a storm cloud on the horizon. The point is that this isn't a story that floats around in some vague fantasy realm. It has coordinates. It has dirt and rivers and cities you could visit today, several of which are still standing, still populated, and still arguing about who they belong to, which tells you something about how little some things change. And keeping those 3 early neighbourhoods straight, the rivers, the Nile, and the little land in the middle, will save you a mountain of confusion down the line. Now for the clock, because we're covering a span of time so ridiculous it's almost hard to hold in your head. The events run from roughly 2,000 years before a certain famous birth, all the way to the 1st century after it. That's about 2,000 years of narrative, which for perspective is longer than the gap between us and the Roman emperors. During that time, civilizations rose, collapsed, got conquered, rebuilt, and collapsed again, and our little strip of land in the middle managed to get caught in almost every round. The earliest characters are wandering herdsmen with tents and livestock. The latest are city dwellers writing letters that get carried across an empire by foot and by boat. If you ever feel lost about where you are on the timeline, just ask a simple question. Are these people living in tents, living in a kingdom with a palace, living in exile far from home, or living under a foreign empire? Those 4 phases are the whole ride, and we'll walk through each one. Here's the part that trips up most first-time readers, so let's clear it up immediately. The Bible is not one book, it's a library. 66 books bound together for convenience, written by more than 40 different people across those 15 centuries, most of whom never met each other, and would probably be baffled to find their work sitting on the same shelf. You've got kings and shepherds, a doctor, a tax collector, a couple of fishermen, and at least one professional government official all contributing. And because it's a library rather than a single book, it contains wildly different types of writing, and expecting all of them to read the same way is like expecting a legal contract, a love poem, and a war documentary to share a tone. They don't. So it helps to know the genres before you walk in. Roughly speaking, there are 7 kinds of writing waiting for you. There's law, which reads like the founding rulebook of a brand new nation, complete with the fine print. There's history, the narrative backbone that tells you who did what and how it all went sideways. There's poetry, the raw emotional core where people yell at the sky, fall in love and wrestle with why life is the way it is. There's prophecy, which is less about predicting lottery numbers and more about angry, brilliant people showing up to tell everyone they've lost the plot. There are the 4 accounts of a single remarkable life, sitting at the hinge of the whole collection. There are letters, actual mail sent to actual groups of people, trying to figure out how to live. And finally there's Apocalypse, the wild, symbol-soaked finale that has confused and delighted readers for 2,000 years. Knowing which genre you're in before you start reading is the difference between understanding a page and staring at it, like it personally offended you. Which brings us to the trick that's going to keep this whole thing glued to your memory. Because let's be honest, 66 books is a lot to keep straight, and human brains are famously bad at holding long lists. So we're going to cheat, using a memory system that has no business working as well as it does. We're pinning each major section of the story to a different Australian animal. Yes, Australia, the continent that decided every one of its creatures should look like it was assembled from spare parts by a committee that had never actually seen a normal animal. The reason this works is that weird images stick in the brain far better than tidy facts, and Australia is basically a factory for weird. Here's your roll call, and don't worry about memorising it all right now, because each one will land properly when we get there. The section of law is anchored by a koala, hunched over and looking exhausted, because as you'll soon discover, the law is a heavy thing to carry. The long, messy history of kings is anchored by an echidna wearing a crown, because that stretch of the story gets pricklier and sadder the further you go. The big, thundering prophets get a boxing kangaroo, because their whole job was to throw a warning and then, unfortunately, a punch. The poetry gets a kookaburra, the bird whose laugh sounds like it knows something you don't, which fits a section that runs through every human emotion. The 4 accounts of that one famous life get a platypus, because like the platypus, they're an impossible blend of things that shouldn't fit together but somehow do. The book about the early movement spreading gets an emu, a bird that physically cannot walk backward, which is almost too perfect, and the letters get a couple of showy little lizards, which will meet at the end. Each creature is a hook, hang the story on the hook, and it stops slipping out of your head. Now a fair question at this point is how these 66 books got chosen in the first place, and why these and not others. The technical word for the approved list is the Canaan, which comes from an old word meaning a measuring reed, basically a ruler. The idea is that these are the writings that measured up, the ones a community recognised over time as carrying real weight and authority, rather than being someone's clever fan fiction. It wasn't a single afternoon meeting where a few people voted things in and out, despite what certain movies would have you believe. It was a slow, centuries-long process of communities using, copying, arguing over, and preserving these texts until a settled list emerged. Plenty of other ancient writings existed and got left out, and the ones that made the cut generally did so because they were old, widely used, and consistent with everything else already accepted. It's less like a committee handpicking winners, and more like the natural way a canon of great literature forms, except with far higher stakes and much longer beards. And here's where a lot of people get suspicious, and reasonably so. If these texts are ancient, and they were copied by hand for centuries before anyone invented a printing press, how do we know the version we read today has any resemblance to the original? Wasn't it all just a giant game of telephone across 1,000 years, ending with something completely garbled? It's a great question, and for a long time it was hard to answer with confidence, because the oldest complete copies we had were separated from the original writings by a very long stretch of time. Then, in the late 1940s, a shepherd chasing a stray animal near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea tossed a rock into a cave and heard pottery shatter. Inside those caves, and others nearby, were jars holding ancient scrolls that had been sitting untouched in the dry desert air for roughly 2,000 years. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they turned out to be one of the most important discoveries in the history of the field, mostly because of what happened when scholars compared them to the copies made 1,000 years later. The scrolls were dramatically older than anything we'd had before, and when researchers laid the ancient texts side by side with the much more recent copies, they found that the two matched to an astonishing degree. The differences were tiny, the kind of thing you'd chalk up to a scribe's spelling preference, rather than a change in meaning. In other words, the game of telephone had been played with obsessive, almost superhuman care. It turns out the scribes copying these texts treated a single misplaced letter as a serious problem, which is a level of quality control most modern software companies could only dream of. So whatever you personally believe about the content, the claim that the text got hopelessly scrambled over the centuries simply doesn't survive contact with the evidence. What people were reading 2,000 years ago is remarkably close to what sits on the page today. There's one last pair of glasses I want to hand you before we begin, because once you're wearing them, you'll see the same shape appearing again and again across all 66 books, and it's the single thread that stitches the whole sprawling library into one story. Very early on, right after everything goes wrong, a promise gets made about someone who will one day show up and fix what broke. The story calls this figure a coming seed, a descendant, a future rescuer, and from that moment the entire narrative becomes a kind of long, winding search. Who is it? When does he arrive? Which family line does he come through? Every generation asks the question. Most of them get it wrong, and the story keeps narrowing the possibilities like a detective closing in on a suspect over the course of a very long novel. If you keep one idea in your head for the next few hours, make it this one. The whole thing is a rescue story that's been waiting for its rescuer since almost the first page. Everything else is just the map showing how we get there. So that's the set, the lighting, and the theme. We know the neighbourhoods, we know the span of time, we know it's a library of 7 genres held together by a promised rescuer. We've got our menagerie of Australian animals ready to hang everything on, and we've seen that the text itself has held together far better than anyone had a right to expect. The camera has finished its wide sweep. Now it's time to zoom all the way in, to the very first page, where the whole thing begins not with a war or a king, but with a garden, 3 characters, and a piece that is about to be spectacularly ruined. The opening book fires every plotline into motion at once, and it does something clever right away by showing you the happy ending first, so you'll spend the rest of the story homesick for it. In a garden called Eden, our 3 main characters appear together for the very first time, and everything is exactly as it should be. There's God, present and close, walking around like a friend rather than a distant force. There are people, at home and unashamed, and there's the land itself, generous and green, producing everything anyone could need without a single weed to pull. This is the baseline. This is the picture of how things are supposed to be, 3 characters in perfect harmony, and I need you to memorize it, because it holds together for a grand total of about 3 chapters before the whole arrangement comes crashing down. The story gives you paradise, and then, almost immediately, takes it away, which is either cruel or brilliant storytelling depending on your mood. The crash comes through a single rule broken. The 2 humans are given the run of the place with exactly one restriction, and, in a plot development that will surprise absolutely no one who has ever met a human being, they go straight for the one thing they were told to avoid. A cunning voice talks them into it. They eat what they weren't supposed to, and the perfect setup shatters. What follows is a chain reaction of consequences, the sort of falling out with reality where nothing works quite right ever again, and the humans get shown the exit from the garden they were born to live in. It's the worst possible outcome, and yet, buried right there in the middle of the bad news comes the first flicker of the promise we talked about, the tiny sentence that launches the entire rest of the library. In the wreckage, a hint is dropped that one day a descendant of these very people will come along and crush the source of all this trouble. It's vague, it's brief, and it's easy to miss, but it's the seed of every hope that follows. The rescue story has officially started, buried in the rubble of the first disaster. From here, the whole book becomes a chase, and the running question is which of these descendants might be the promised one. The answer, over and over, is not this guy. First up are the very first brothers, and the older one, consumed by jealousy over a rejected offering, kills his younger brother in a field, which pretty definitively rules him out and establishes a grim pattern early. Things go so far downhill so fast that eventually the story hits a full reset. A man named Noah, described as the one decent person left in a deeply rotten generation, is told to build a truly enormous boat because a flood is coming to wipe the slate clean. He does, the waters rise, his family and a floating zoo survive, and when the whole thing finally drains, humanity gets a fresh start. And then, in a detail the story is refreshingly honest about, Noah celebrates surviving the end of the world by planting a vineyard and getting spectacularly drunk. So much for our hero. Clearly the rescuer isn't him either. The pattern continues at a place called Babel, where the survivors decide the smart move is to build a tower tall enough to make a name for themselves, a monument to their own greatness. This goes about as well as most monuments to human ego, and the project ends with everyone suddenly speaking different languages, unable to understand a word their neighbour is saying, scattering across the earth in confused little groups. If you've ever wondered why humanity is spread out and divided into countless tongues, this is the story's answer, and it doubles as a rather pointed commentary on what happens when people build things purely to feel important. Then the whole story narrows down, dramatically, to one man. Out of that scattered, confused mass of humanity, a herdsman named Abram gets a personal invitation to pack up his entire life, leave his home, and walk toward a land he's never seen, on nothing but a promise. And what a promise it is. He's told his descendants will become a great nation, that they'll be given that little land in the middle we mapped earlier, and crucially, that through his family every nation on earth will one day be blessed. That last part is the promise thread lighting up again, brighter now, and it's the reason this one wandering man matters so much. Here's the catch that makes it almost comedic. Abram and his wife are old and childless, and being told they'll become a nation the size of the stars. He believes it anyway, which is either remarkable faith or a testament to how persuasive the offer was, and against all odds a son named Isaac eventually arrives. Isaac's chapter includes one of the most famously tense moments in the whole collection, when Abraham is asked to give up the very son he waited a lifetime for, only to be stopped at the last possible second, a replacement provided in the boy's place. It's a scene that has launched 1,000 debates, and the story lets it sit heavy without tidying it up. The promise then passes down through Isaac to his son Jacob, who is, to put it gently, a piece of work. Jacob is a schemer, a manipulator who cons his own brother out of his inheritance and has to flee for his life to avoid the consequences. Not exactly the noble hero you'd expect the great promise to run through, but that's rather the point. Years later, on his way home to face the family he wronged, Jacob has a strange all-night wrestling match with a mysterious figure, comes out limping, and gets a brand new name, Israel. That name sticks, and it becomes the name of the entire nation that descends from him. So the whole people group at the centre of this story is named after a reformed con artist who once wrestled God to a draw and walked away with a limp and a blessing. The story has a sense of humour about its own heroes. Jacob, now Israel, has 12 sons, and those 12 become the 12 tribes that make up the nation from here on out. But the spotlight falls on one of them, a younger son named Joseph, who is unmistakably his father's favourite and unfortunately not subtle about it. His brothers, sick of his dreams and his obvious special treatment, sell him off to passing traders and tell their father he's dead, which is a fairly extreme response to sibling favouritism. Joseph ends up enslaved in Egypt, then thrown in prison on a false accusation, hitting rock bottom in a foreign country with no one coming to help. And then, in a turn the story clearly enjoys, his knack for interpreting dreams gets him hauled in front of Egypt's ruler, who is having nightmares no one can explain. Joseph reads them as a warning of a coming famine, lays out a plan to survive it, and gets promoted overnight from the dungeon to second in command of the entire nation, which is quite the career pivot. When the famine hits exactly as predicted, it's severe enough to drive Joseph's starving family down to Egypt looking for food, having no idea the powerful official they're begging is the brother they betrayed and left for dead. The reunion that follows is one of the story's genuine emotional peaks, all the old resentment dissolving into forgiveness, and Joseph, rather than settling the score he'd every right to settle, tells his stunned brothers that what they meant for harm had somehow been turned toward good. He arranges for his whole family to settle safely in Egypt to wait out the hard years, and there it is. The promised family, the descendants who are supposed to become a great nation, are now comfortably parked in Egypt, safe and fed and multiplying. It looks like a happy ending. It is very much not a happy ending, but you'll have to wait a moment to find out why, because that particular problem belongs to the next book, and it involves a change in management that goes badly for everyone. That next stretch is 4 books long, and it tells the story of how a family of refugees turns into an actual nation, forged, as these things usually are, in a fire nobody enjoyed. When we pick up the thread, generations have passed. Joseph and everyone who remembered his heroics are long gone, and the family has grown into a genuinely large population. A new ruler looks at all these foreigners multiplying inside his borders and does the classic tyrant math, deciding that the safest thing to do with a group he fears is to crush them into slavery. So the descendants of the promise spend generations in brutal forced labour, which is a long way from the great and blessed nation they were told they'd become. The promise looks frankly dead in the water. Enter the man the story raises up to fix it, whose origin reads like a myth on purpose. Born during a period when the ruler had ordered the elimination of the enslaved population's baby boys, an infant is hidden in a waterproofed basket and floated down the river in a desperate gamble by his mother. In a twist so bold it borders on cheeky, the basket is found by none other than the ruler's own daughter, who takes the child in and raises him inside the palace of the very man trying to wipe out his people. This is Moses, who grows up as royalty while his own people suffer in the fields outside. As a young man, he sees an enslaved worker being beaten, loses his temper, and things go badly enough that he has to flee into the wilderness, where he spends years as a nobody tending sheep, which is a dramatic downgrade from Prince of Egypt, but excellent preparation for what's coming. His recruitment happens at a bush that is on fire but somehow refuses to burn up, which is the kind of thing that gets your attention. From that impossible bush, Moses is told to march back into Egypt, confront the most powerful man in the region, and demand the release of an entire enslaved workforce. Moses, reasonably, lists every excuse he can think of, including that he isn't much of a public speaker, which is a relatable objection for a man being asked to debate a god-king. He goes anyway. What follows is a showdown between Moses and the ruler, who is not remotely interested in freeing his free labour force. So a series of escalating disasters rolls across Egypt, one after another, each one a direct challenge to the ruler's stubbornness, and each one making the point that his power is not as absolute as he thinks. The pattern is almost comically repetitive. A disaster hits, the ruler panics and promises to let everyone go, the disaster lifts, and the moment the pressure is off, he changes his mind and doubles down. This happens again and again, a masterclass in refusing to learn a lesson, and each round raises the stakes a little higher. It's the ancient equivalent of someone hitting the snooze button while the house fills with smoke, convinced the problem will sort itself out. The final and most severe of these disasters is the one that breaks him, and it's marked by an event the nation will commemorate forever after. Each family among the enslaved people is instructed to mark their doorways with the blood of a lamb, so that the coming judgment passes over their homes and spares them. That night the ruler finally catastrophically relents, and the entire nation walks out of Egypt in a mass exodus, generations of slavery ending in a single night. They leave in such a hurry there isn't even time to let their bread rise, a small domestic detail that becomes a permanent part of how the event is remembered every year afterward. Naturally, the ruler changes his mind almost immediately, because at this point that's simply what he does, and sends his army thundering after them, cornering the escaping crowd against a sea with nowhere left to run. And then comes the story's signature miracle, the waters splitting apart to open a dry path straight through, the freed people crossing to safety, and the pursuing army meeting a very bad end when the sea returns to normal at exactly the wrong moment for them. The nation is born, free at last, standing on the far shore watching the water close behind them. Their freedom lasts about 5 minutes before they discover that the wilderness is not a fun place to live, and much of what follows is a long lesson in how a mob of former slaves slowly, grumpily, learns to become a people with laws and an identity. They arrive at a mountain, and there the whole thing gets its constitution. Amid smoke and thunder, the nation receives its founding rules, the famous 10 to start, followed by a much larger and more detailed body of law covering just about every aspect of life you could imagine, from justice to farming to how to treat a neighbour. 613 individual regulations in total, which is a lot of homework for a people who, up to this point, mostly just wanted lunch. The law is meant to shape them into a nation that lives differently from everyone around them, a visible answer to that old promise about blessing the whole world. The very human problem, of course, is that the people can't even wait for the rules to finish being delivered. While Moses is up on the mountain receiving all of this, the crowd at the bottom gets restless, decides their leader has vanished, and talks his own brother into melting down their jewelry to build a golden statue of a calf to worship instead. So the ink is barely dry on the command about not doing exactly this when they go and do exactly this, which is a stunning display of terrible timing. It's a low point, and it nearly ends the whole relationship right there. But the story swings unexpectedly toward mercy. After a serious reckoning, forgiveness is extended, the relationship is patched back together, and the book ends on a genuinely beautiful note. The people construct a special portable tent, a movable sacred space at the center of their camp, so that God can once again dwell right in the middle of them. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's the story quietly reaching back toward the garden, toward the original picture of those three characters living together in harmony. The people broke that arrangement, but here's a first, partial step toward getting it back, one tent at a time. The next book slows way down to answer a question the tent raises, which is why access to God comes with so many rules and so much careful distance. If the whole point is closeness, why all the barriers? The answer, laid out in exhaustive detail, is a system of offerings and a dedicated priesthood, a whole apparatus for how flawed people can safely approach a perfect God without the whole thing going wrong. Central to it is the idea of a substitute, the notion that the cost of wrongdoing gets transferred onto something else so that the person can go free. It's the concept that will echo through the entire rest of the story, so even if the details of ancient offerings feel distant, the underlying idea is the one to hold on to. The book also draws hard lines between what's considered clean and unclean, covering everything from which animals are fine to eat to what to do about mold in the walls, a level of domestic micromanagement that would make a modern health inspector weep with joy. It lays out moral standards and, in one sobering episode, shows two of the priests improvising their own version of a sacred ritual and paying a terrible price for treating holy things casually. The message lands with a thud. This is not a system to freelance. It's easy, from a comfortable distance of a few thousand years, to find all these regulations tedious, and plenty of readers hit this book and quietly give up. But the underlying logic is consistent throughout. If a perfect God is going to live in the middle of an imperfect people, there have to be terms, and the terms are what the whole book is spelling out in relentless detail. Then comes the book of the long, weary journey, which follows the nation as it wanders through the wilderness and repeatedly demonstrates that freedom did not automatically make anyone grateful. It opens with a head count, a full census of the fighting men, and then sets the people marching toward the land they were promised. When they finally reach its edge, they send 12 scouts ahead to assess the situation. The scouts come back and confirm the land is genuinely wonderful, everything they'd been told, but 10 of the 12 are terrified because the current inhabitants are enormous and the cities are fortified, and they conclude the whole thing is hopeless. Only 2 of the scouts argue that with a promise this solid behind them, they should go for it. The crowd sides with the frightened majority, throws a full-scale tantrum about wanting to go back to slavery, of all things, and as a result the whole generation is told they'll spend 40 years circling the wilderness until the fearful adults have passed on and a braver generation is ready. It's a long, slow consequence for a moment of collective cowardice, and if you've ever done 4 decades of penance for one bad decision made in a single afternoon, you have some sense of the scale of it. The book is a parade of complaints, rebellions, and the occasional bizarre interlude. The complaints are almost impressive in their range. The people grumble about the water, then about the food, then, remarkably, they complain that the miraculous food keeping them alive in a barren desert has become boring, which is the kind of feedback you can only give when survival itself has stopped feeling like an achievement. Various leaders challenge Moses for authority. Various groups decide they'd run things better, and it rarely ends well for the challengers. The strangest interlude of all involves a hired prophet sent to curse the nation, who instead ends up delivering blessings, at one point out-argued by his own donkey, which the story presents as suddenly and matter-of-factly able to speak. The prophet, for the record, takes the talking donkey remarkably in stride, arguing with it as though a chatty pack animal were a minor inconvenience rather than the strangest thing that has ever happened to him. It's exactly as odd on the page as it sounds, and it's a reminder that this library is full of surprises for anyone expecting it to be uniformly solemn. The 4th and final book of this stretch is essentially one long farewell. The generation that failed at the edge of the land has passed, a new generation stands ready, and the aging leader gathers them for a series of parting speeches before the crossing. He walks them back through everything that's happened, restates the promises and the rules, and urges them in the strongest possible terms to actually remember all of it once they're settled and comfortable. Because the great danger, he warns, isn't hardship but forgetting. He names his successor, a bold man who had been one of the only 2 scouts brave enough to trust the promise all those years ago. And in a moment that's genuinely poignant, the great leader himself is not permitted to enter the land he spent his entire life walking toward. He's allowed to climb a mountain and see it spread out before him, the destination of a lifetime laid out in full view, and then his story ends there, on the wrong side of the border, gazing at a home he'll never set foot in. It's a strangely humbling close for the towering figure of these 4 books, and it makes the point that no single leader is the real hero here. The story is bigger than any of them, and that's the section anchored, if you remember our menagerie, by the koala hunched over and looking utterly worn out. The reason is simple once you've been through these 4 books. The law is heavy. All those rules, all those offerings, all that careful distance, all the weight of a nation learning to carry an identity it kept dropping. It adds up to a genuine burden, and the koala slumped under the load is exactly the image to hang it on. Keep that tired little creature in mind, because the whole point of the weight is that eventually the story is going to promise someone who can carry it for everyone. But that's a long way off. For now, the nation stands at the border, their founding leader buried behind them, a new commander in front of them, and an entire land full of giants waiting on the other side of the river. Think about the odds from their point of view for a second. They are a wandering people with no cities, no chariots, and no professional army, and they are about to march against fortified towns defended by soldiers who tower over them. On paper, it's absurd. The only thing they have going for them is a promise made generations ago to a childless old herdsman, which is either everything or nothing depending on how much you trust the one who made it. The rules are written. The people are ready, or at least they think they are. All that's left is to walk across and take hold of the promise, which, as you might have guessed by now, is going to be nowhere near as simple as it sounds. The river crossing turns out to be the least of anyone's worries, because the moment the nation sets foot on the far bank, they're standing in a land that already belongs to somebody else, and those somebodies have walls, weapons, and absolutely no interest in relocating. Command has passed to the bold successor who once came back from scouting that land insisting they could take it, and now he gets to find out whether he was right. What follows is essentially a war documentary. One long military campaign as a nation of former wanderers tries to claim the home they were promised generations ago, and the first target is a fortress city with defences so thick they were considered impossible to breach. The plan for taking that first city is where things get delightfully strange, because it is not a plan any general in history would have signed off on. Instead of building siege engines or digging under the walls, the army is told to simply march around the city once a day for 6 days, in complete silence, while priests carry sacred objects and blow horns. The defenders on the walls must have watched this daily parade with growing confusion, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate psychological warfare, or if the invaders had simply lost their minds. On the 7th day, the army circles the city 7 times, lets out an enormous shout, and the walls come down on their own. It is, without question, the least conventional battle strategy in the whole collection, and it works precisely because it was never really about the strategy. The point being hammered home is that the victory doesn't come from superior engineering. The people just had to show up and trust the instructions, even when the instructions sounded absurd. Tucked inside that dramatic collapse is one of the story's favourite tricks, which is handing a starring role to someone the audience would least expect. Before the city falls, 2 scouts sneak in to assess the defences and end up sheltered by a local woman named Rahab, who runs what we might politely call a disreputable establishment. She's a foreigner, an outsider, and by every social measure of the time about as far from a hero as you could get. She hides the scouts, lies to the authorities hunting them, and cuts a deal to spare her family when the city falls, all because she'd heard the stories of this nation's god and decided to bet everything on them being true. When the walls collapse, her household is the one thing left standing, and this unlikely woman ends up woven permanently into the nation's family tree. The story keeps quietly making the same point. The people God pulls in are rarely the ones anyone would have picked from the lineup. Not every episode goes smoothly though, and the campaign hits an ugly snag when a single soldier decides the rules about not looting a conquered city don't apply to him. A man named Achan pockets some forbidden treasure and buries it under his tent, figuring nobody will notice. Unfortunately for everyone, the next battle against a much smaller and weaker town ends in a humiliating defeat, and the whole army suddenly finds itself losing to opponents it should have crushed. The problem gets traced back to Achan's private stash, and the lesson lands hard. One person's quiet greed drags down the entire community, which is a sobering thought for anyone who has ever assumed their small private compromise affects only themselves. Once the matter is dealt with, the campaign resumes its momentum, and over the following stretch the nation works its way through the land, defeating a remarkable roster of local rulers, 31 kings in total, each one a separate walled city with its own throne. Along the way there's a battle so pivotal that, according to the account, the daylight itself seemed to stretch out to let the fighting finish, one of those larger-than-life moments the book drops in without much fanfare, and then simply moves on from, as if an extended afternoon were a perfectly ordinary tactical advantage. The campaign is relentless, town after town, and it's worth remembering that none of this was quick or clean. Claiming a homeland that was already fully occupied took years of grinding, exhausting effort, and the tidy summary of 31 defeated kings compresses what was, for the people living it, a very long and very tiring war. When the fighting finally settles, the conquered land gets carved up and distributed among the 12 tribes, descended from those 12 sons we met earlier, each tribe receiving its own portion to settle and farm, and the messy business of turning a battlefield into a series of neighbouring homesteads begins. Their aging commander gathers everyone one last time before he dies, and lays out a stark choice, telling them plainly that they'll have to decide for themselves who they intend to follow, because he and his household have already made up their minds. It's a genuinely hopeful moment. The land is won, the tribes are settled, the promise made to that childless herdsman generations ago has, against all odds, come true. And then the next book arrives and cheerfully sets fire to all of it. Here is where the story enters what might be its most chaotic and morally exhausting stretch, and the mechanism behind the chaos is heartbreakingly simple. Once the strong leaders die off and there's no central authority holding everyone together, the nation settles into a repeating cycle that would be comical if it weren't so bleak. It goes like this. The people get comfortable, drift away from their God, and start adopting the religions of the neighbours they were supposed to keep their distance from. Trouble follows, usually in the form of some hostile group moving in to oppress them. After enough suffering, they finally cry out for help. A rescuer gets raised up to deliver them, peace returns for a while, and then, the moment things are good again, they forget the whole lesson and slide right back into the same behaviour. Rinse and repeat, except each loop tends to end up darker than the last. It's the historical equivalent of never learning from your mistakes, on a national scale, for several centuries. What makes it genuinely tragic rather than just frustrating is that the pattern was completely avoidable every single time. The people knew the deal. They'd been warned repeatedly by that aging commander before he died. And still, the instant a crisis passed and life got comfortable again, the memory of the last catastrophe seemed to evaporate, and off they went making the identical mistake their parents had made a generation earlier. If you've ever watched someone repeat a bad relationship or a bad habit, while insisting this time will be different, you already understand the emotional logic of this entire book. Comfort has a way of erasing hard-won lessons faster than almost anything else, and the era of the judges is essentially a very long demonstration of that uncomfortable truth. The rescuers who show up in each cycle are the judges the book is named after, though the word is misleading, since they're less courtroom officials and more emergency deliverers, a wildly assorted collection of unlikely champions. There's a left-handed man named Ehud, who exploits the fact that everyone expected a weapon on the opposite side, and uses his unexpected handedness to get past a corrupt and enormously overweight foreign ruler who'd been squeezing the people for tribute. It's a wonderfully clever piece of misdirection, a reminder that in this book deliverance often comes through cunning rather than raw strength, and through people whose supposed disadvantages turn out to be the very thing that saves the day. There's Deborah, a sharp and respected leader who directs a military campaign when the man who's supposed to lead it gets cold feet and refuses to go without her at his side, a detail the book records without any fuss, simply letting the competent person be competent while the designated hero hesitates. The decisive blow in that particular conflict is delivered not by any soldier, but by a woman named Jael, who welcomes the fleeing enemy commander into her tent, offers him a drink, waits for him to fall asleep, and finishes the job with a tent peg, proving that in this era hospitality could turn lethal without much warning. The pattern across all of them is the same. The deliverers are almost never who you'd pick. The victories almost never come the way you'd expect, and the whole point seems to be that rescue keeps arriving from the least likely directions. Then there's Gideon, who might be the most relatable of the bunch because he spends most of his introduction anxiously asking for proof that he's really the one being called, laying out a fleece overnight and demanding signs before he'll commit to anything. Once he finally agrees, he assembles an army, only to be told his force is far too large. Because if they win with that many men, they'll credit themselves rather than their god. Even his famous request for signs, laying a piece of wool on the ground overnight and asking for it to be wet while the surrounding earth stayed dry, then reversing the whole test the next night just to be absolutely certain, reads like a man desperately double-checking an email before hitting send on something terrifying. So the army gets trimmed down, again and again, through a bizarre selection process based on how the men drink water, until Gideon is left with a laughably small band of just 300. With that tiny group, he stages a nighttime surprise using torches and horns and a lot of noise, and routs a vastly larger enemy camp that panics in the dark. It's a spectacular underdog victory built entirely on the idea that a small group trusting the plan beats a large group trusting itself. Not every Judge story ends in triumph, and the book doesn't pretend otherwise. There's the tragic figure of Jephthah, an outcast who makes a hasty, ill-considered vow before a battle without thinking through the consequences, and ends up trapped by his own rash words in one of the darkest and most debated episodes in the entire collection. The story presents it without any tidy resolution, letting the weight of a reckless promise sit there as a grim warning about the danger of bargaining when you're desperate and not thinking clearly. It's a sobering reminder that the Book of Deliverers is also, quietly, a catalogue of what happens when good intentions run ahead of good sense. And then there's the one everyone remembers, the legendary strongman gifted with supernatural physical power on the condition that he keep a particular vow, most famously about never cutting his hair. He is, to put it charitably, not the most disciplined hero. His life is a string of impulsive decisions and personal grudges that he happens to be strong enough to survive. At one point, in an act of pure vengeful creativity, he ties torches to the tails of 300 foxes and sends them running through the enemy's fields. On another occasion, cornered and unarmed, he grabs the jawbone of a donkey and single-handedly fights off an entire attacking force with it, which is not a sentence you get to write about most historical figures. His downfall comes through a woman named Delilah, who is paid to discover the secret of his strength, and, after several failed attempts where he lies to her, finally wears him down until he confesses that it's tied to his uncut hair. She has it cut while he sleeps, his strength evaporates, his enemies capture and blind him, and it looks like the end. But in a final act, positioned between the pillars of a packed enemy temple, his strength returns one last time, and he brings the entire structure down. It's a dramatic, tragic finish for a man who was gifted everything and squandered most of it on personal vendettas, and it fits the mood of a book that keeps watching potential get wasted. The refrain that echoes through this whole grim stretch sums it up perfectly, and it appears again and again like a drumbeat. In those days there was no king, and everyone simply did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. That's the diagnosis of the entire era. Without any shared authority or common direction, everyone became their own final judge of right and wrong, and the results were exactly as messy as you'd expect, when a whole society decides that personal preference is the only rule that matters. The book doesn't shy away from showing just how ugly that gets, closing on a few genuinely disturbing episodes that read like a society coming apart at the seams, the kind of stories the book seems to include precisely so you can't walk away thinking the era of do whatever feels right was some kind of charming, free-spirited golden age. It was not. It was chaos, and the book wants you to feel the full weight of it. The book ends in genuine moral darkness, and it's clearly setting up a hunger for something better, some kind of stable leadership that could hold the fractured tribes together. Dropped right into the middle of all this darkness, almost as a deliberate contrast, is a small, quiet, tender story that reads nothing like the surrounding chaos. It follows a foreign woman named Ruth, from a neighbouring people the nation generally didn't get along with, who was married into a family of the nation and then lost her husband. Left widowed and with no obligation to stay, she makes the remarkable choice to remain loyal to her grieving mother-in-law, declaring that she'll go wherever the older woman goes and adopt her people and her God as her own. The two of them, both widows with no means of support, return to the mother-in-law's homeland with nothing, and Ruth ends up gleaning leftover grain in the fields just to keep them both fed, which was the ancient safety net for the destitute, and about as dignified as it sounds. There, working the edges of a field, she comes to the attention of the landowner, a decent and generous man named Boaz, who happens to be a relative positioned to help. The custom she's relying on to survive is itself a small window into the era's better instincts. Farmers were expected to leave the corners and dropped stalks of their harvest unharvested, so that the poor, the widowed, and the foreigner could come and gather what they needed, an early and rather humane form of social welfare built right into the agricultural calendar. Boaz not only permits Ruth to glean, but quietly instructs his workers to leave extra behind for her and to make sure no one bothers her. Small kindnesses that say a great deal about his character before the story ever calls him a hero. In the customs of the time, a close relative could step in to rescue a family fallen on hard times by taking on their debts and marrying into the line, a role sometimes called a kinsman redeemer, essentially a family member with both the right and the willingness to buy back what was lost. Boaz takes on exactly this role, marries Ruth, and restores security to the two widows who had nothing. It's a gentle, almost domestic story of loyalty and rescue, and it would be easy to overlook if not for the punchline the book saves for the very end. This foreign woman, this outsider from a people the nation was often at odds with, turns out to be the great-grandmother of the most important king the nation will ever produce. A pagan immigrant is grafted directly into the royal bloodline, and once again the story is making its favourite point in the clearest possible terms. Outsiders are not just tolerated in this tale, they're welcomed, valued, and sometimes placed right at the centre of the whole plan. It's a warm little island of hope in an otherwise dark chapter, and it plants the seed for everything that comes next. This whole long stretch of the story, from the conquest through the chaos and beyond into everything that follows, gets anchored, if you remember our Australian menagerie, by an echidna wearing a crown. The echidna is that spiny little creature covered in sharp quills, and the crown signals that we've entered the long era of the nation's leaders. The reason it fits so well becomes painfully clear the further you go. This section of the story gets pricklier, sharper, and sadder with almost every generation, as the leadership gets worse and worse, and the promising start curdles into disappointment. Keep that crowned, thorny image in mind, because we are about to watch a nation get exactly what it asks for, discover that it wasn't what they actually needed, and slowly fall apart under the weight of one bad ruler after another. The trouble starts, as trouble often does, with the people wanting something because everyone else has it. Looking at the surrounding nations with their kings and palaces and organised armies, the tribes decide that what they really need to feel legitimate is a proper monarch of their own, a single royal figure to lead them into battle and make them look like a real country. The last of the old-style deliverers, a respected prophet and leader named Samuel who had guided the people faithfully, is understandably hurt by the request, since it amounts to the nation saying they'd prefer a flashy human ruler to the arrangement they already had. He warns them, in considerable detail, exactly what a king will cost them, that a king will take their sons for his wars, their daughters for his household, their best land for his officials, and a healthy cut of everything they produce for his treasury. The people listen to this thorough list of downsides and respond with an enthusiastic yes anyway, because they want to be like everyone else more than they want to be free, which is a very human trade to make. So they get their king, and on paper he's exactly what they pictured. He's tall, striking, and looks every inch the part, the kind of man central casting would send over for the role of impressive monarch. Unfortunately, looking like a king and being one turn out to be very different skills. Almost immediately, the new ruler starts making anxious, impatient decisions, overstepping his bounds when he panics, disobeying clear instructions when they become inconvenient, and generally revealing that beneath the handsome exterior sits a deeply insecure man who cannot handle pressure. On one occasion, waiting for the prophet to arrive and perform a ritual before a battle, he loses his nerve, decides he can't wait any longer, and takes on a sacred role that was never his to take, all because standing still and trusting the plan felt unbearable. On another, given a very specific instruction, he decides to follow only the parts he likes, and keep the valuable spoils he'd been told to leave, then acts baffled when this is treated as disobedience rather than clever improvisation. His reign becomes a slow-motion demonstration that appearance is not competence, that a crown does not confer character, and it isn't long before it becomes clear the throne needs a different occupant. That occupant arrives in the most understated way imaginable. Sent to a modest family to secretly anoint the next king, the old prophet works his way through a lineup of tall, strong, promising-looking sons and gets told none of them is the one. The actual choice is the youngest, an overlooked shepherd boy out tending the flock, so unremarkable in his family's eyes that nobody thought to include him in the lineup. He is quietly marked as the future king while the current one is still very much on the throne, which sets up an awkward situation to say the least. It's worth appreciating the strangeness of the arrangement. There are now, effectively, two anointed kings walking around at the same time, one sitting on the actual throne and unravelling, and one out in the fields who officially has the job but can't say so to anyone without getting himself killed. David has to spend years knowing what's coming while pretending he doesn't, which is a peculiar kind of patience most people never have to practice. This young shepherd, named David, then steps onto the national stage in the most famous underdog moment in the whole collection. An enemy army is deadlocked with the nation's forces across a valley, and their champion is a giant of a man, a towering, heavily armoured warrior who strides out every day to taunt the terrified soldiers and challenge anyone brave enough to face him one-on-one. Nobody volunteers for the entirely sensible reason that he is enormous and they'd like to keep living. The shepherd boy, visiting the camp to bring food to his older brothers, hears the taunts, is baffled that nobody has done anything, and volunteers himself, armed with nothing but a sling and a handful of smooth stones from a stream. He turns down the offer of heavy armour because he can barely move in it, walks out to face the giant with his simple weapon, and drops the massive warrior with a single well-aimed stone before the fight even really begins. It is the ultimate small versus large story, and it launches David from anonymous shepherd to national hero overnight. It also earns him an unlikely and devoted friend in the king's own son, a brave and honourable young man who, in one of the story's genuinely touching relationships, chooses loyalty to David over his own claim to the throne, effectively rooting for the person destined to replace his family. It's a rare bit of warmth, and it makes the coming years all the more bittersweet. Predictably, the sitting king does not take kindly to a young upstart getting more praise than he does. As David's fame grows and the crowd starts singing his praises above the king's, the older man is consumed by a jealousy that curdles into full-blown paranoia. He spends much of the rest of the book obsessively hunting David across the wilderness, hurling spears at him, and generally unravelling into a portrait of what envy does to a person when left to fester. David, for his part, spends years as a fugitive, gathering a ragtag band of followers and repeatedly refusing to harm the king, even when he has clear opportunities to end the whole ordeal, choosing to wait rather than seize the throne by force. Eventually the tormented king meets a grim end in battle, and the path finally clears for David to take his place. The next book follows David's reign, and it opens on a high note. He unites the fractured tribes into a single kingdom, captures a well-positioned city to serve as his capital, and presides over a genuine golden age. He's celebrated as the model king, a man deeply devoted despite his flaws, and the story clearly loves him. It's during this high point that the promise thread we've been tracking takes a major leap forward, because David is given a startling assurance that his royal house will endure, that a descendant from his own line will hold a throne that never truly ends. Suddenly the ancient promise about a coming rescuer has an address. Whoever this future figure turns out to be, the story now tells us, he'll come from the family of this shepherd-turned-king, which narrows the long search considerably and gives the reader a specific bloodline to watch. Which makes what happens next land all the harder, because David, at the height of his power and with nothing left to prove, throws it all into jeopardy over a catastrophic personal failure. Spotting a beautiful married woman named Bathsheba, he abuses his royal authority to take her, and when the resulting pregnancy threatens to expose him, he arranges to have her husband, a loyal soldier serving faithfully in his own army, placed on the front lines and abandoned there to die. It's a cold, calculated cover-up, and it's a stunning fall for the story's golden hero, a reminder that power corrodes even the people we most admire. The consequences ripple through the rest of his life and never fully leave him. His own family fractures, and one of his sons, Absalom, eventually mounts a full-scale rebellion, turning the people against his father and driving David out of his own capital in humiliation. The uprising is eventually put down, but it costs David his son, and his grief over that loss is one of the rawest moments in the whole collection. A powerful father weeping helplessly over a child who died trying to overthrow him, crying out that he would gladly have died in the young man's place. It's a startlingly honest portrait of a parent's love surviving even the deepest betrayal, and it complicates any neat verdict on either of them. The remainder of David's reign is shadowed by these family tragedies, the private cost of his earlier failures following him into old age long after the public scandal had faded. Through all the wreckage, though, the promised line quietly survives, continuing on through another of David's sons, a child named Solomon, who will inherit the throne and carry the story forward. The golden hero ends his reign a diminished, sorrowful man, but the thread of the great promise stays intact, running now through his royal house. The next stretch covers roughly 400 years of the monarchy, and it starts about as well as it possibly could. Solomon takes the throne and asks, when offered anything he wants, not for wealth or long life or the defeat of his enemies, but for wisdom to lead well, which impresses everyone and earns him not just the wisdom, but the wealth and prestige too. The most famous demonstration of that wisdom comes when two women appear before him, each claiming to be the mother of the same baby, with no witnesses to settle it. Solomon proposes with a completely straight face to simply divide the child in half and give each woman a portion, knowing full well that the real mother would rather surrender the baby entirely than see it harmed. The true mother instantly begs him to give the child to the other woman, revealing herself in the process, and the case is solved. It's a clever bit of psychological theatre, and it cemented his reputation as the sharpest mind in the region. His reign is the peak of the entire monarchy, a period of dazzling prosperity, international fame, and staggering riches, and his crowning achievement is the construction of a magnificent permanent temple, a grand and glorious home for the sacred presence that had until then lived in that portable tent from the wilderness days. For a shining moment, the nation is at the height of its power, and the three characters look nearly reunited, God dwelling among his people in their own land in a splendid house built for the purpose. It is as close to the original garden picture as the story has come since the beginning. The temple itself was designed to make that connection unmistakable, decorated with images of a garden, of fruit and trees and guarding figures, a deliberate architectural echo of that first perfect place where everything began. Standing inside it, a worshipper was meant to feel, at least faintly, like they'd stepped back toward Eden. For one generation, the long ache of separation that started when the first humans were shown the exit seemed almost soothed. And then the wisest man in the story does something remarkably unwise. Over the course of his long reign, Solomon accumulates an enormous collection of foreign wives and alliances, and to keep them all happy, he starts building shrines to their various foreign gods, gradually letting his own devotion drift away in the process. The man famous for wisdom ends his life having quietly abandoned the very thing that made his reign great, which is a rather pointed lesson about how even the wisest people can be slowly compromised by comfort and accommodation. The damage doesn't fully surface until after his death, when his son inherits the throne and immediately faces a crucial decision. The people, exhausted by the heavy taxes and forced labour that funded all of Solomon's grand projects, come asking for relief. The young new king, ignoring the seasoned advisors who urge him to ease up and listening instead to his arrogant young friends, responds by promising to be even harsher than his father, which is possibly the single worst political decision in the entire book. The kingdom shatters instantly. 10 of the tribes in the north break away in disgust and form their own separate kingdom under a rival leader, keeping the old national name of Israel, while only the southern territory, centered on the capital and the temple, stays loyal to Solomon's line under the name Judah. From this point the story splits and has to track two kingdoms at once, a divided nation that will never be whole again. This makes the narrative genuinely tricky to follow, because it starts flipping back and forth between north and south, king by overlapping king, and the reader has to keep straight which throne they're currently watching. A useful shortcut is that the north, with its unbroken run of bad leadership, is essentially a slow-motion cautionary tale, while the south is the line that actually matters for the promise, since it carries David's royal family forward through all the turmoil. The northern kingdom gets off to a bad start and never recovers, ruled by a long parade of increasingly awful kings, every one of whom leads the people further into the idol worship that had caused so much trouble before. Not a single northern king manages to be a good one, which is a fairly damning batting average across that many generations. The low point of the north arrives with a particularly notorious royal couple, a weak-willed king named Ahab and his ruthless foreign queen, Jezebel, who together drag the kingdom into its deepest corruption yet aggressively promoting foreign worship and stamping out anyone who objects. Standing against them is one of the story's most dramatic figures, a wild prophet named Elijah, who confronts the royal establishment head-on and stages a spectacular public showdown to prove which God is real, calling down fire in front of the whole nation when the opposing side's prayers produce nothing but embarrassed silence. Leading up to that confrontation, Elijah announces a years-long drought to demonstrate that the foreign storm god the queen promoted couldn't even manage rain in his supposed specialty, which is a fairly pointed way to make a theological argument. And after his great public victory, in a beautifully human twist, Elijah promptly collapses into exhaustion and despair, convinced he's the only faithful person left, and has to be gently reassured, not with more fire and spectacle, but with a quiet, almost whispering stillness. A reminder that the loudest moment isn't always where the important things happen. His story ends not with death, but with a dramatic departure in a whirlwind, passing his role to a successor named Elisha, who continues the work with a whole string of remarkable miracles of his own, from purifying poisoned water to multiplying a widow's tiny supply of oil until her debts were paid. These prophets are the last line of resistance, lonely voices insisting the nation remember who it's supposed to be, while its leaders march it steadily toward disaster. The disaster, when it comes, arrives on schedule for both kingdoms, just a bit over a century apart. The northern kingdom, having exhausted every warning, falls first. In the year 722 before the Common Era, a brutal rising empire from the region of the Great Rivers, the Assyrians, sweeps in, conquers the north, and hauls its people away into exile, effectively erasing those 10 tribes from the map. The southern kingdom limps on for another century and change, occasionally producing a decent king who briefly reverses the decline but never fixing the underlying rot. A couple of these southern rulers are genuinely admirable, one who trusts his way through a terrifying siege when a foreign army camps outside his walls, and a later one who, as a young king, stumbles across a long-forgotten copy of the ancient law during temple repairs, reads it, is horrified at how far the nation has drifted, and launches a sweeping reform to set things right. For a moment it looks like the South might just save itself, but these reforms never quite outlast the reformers, and each good king is followed by someone who quietly undoes the progress, so the overall trajectory keeps pointing downward, no matter how many brief recoveries interrupt it. Then, in 586 before the Common Era, an even mightier empire, Babylon, under its famous ruler Nebuchadnezzar, descends on the southern capital, breaks through its defences, burns the city to the ground, and demolishes that magnificent temple Solomon had built, carrying the survivors off into captivity far from home. And there, at the smoking ruin of everything, the 3 characters we've been tracking since the very first garden are torn violently apart once again. God's presence, which had filled that beautiful temple, no longer has a house standing. The people are dragged away in chains to a foreign land, and the land itself, the promise fulfilled after all those centuries of struggle, lies conquered and empty behind them. Everything that had been so painstakingly assembled, the nation, the kingdom, the temple, the reunion of those 3 characters, is undone in a matter of days. The people who once begged for a king to make them like everyone else have ended up with no king, no temple, no land, and no home, sitting in exile hundreds of miles away, wondering how a story that started with such an enormous promise could possibly have collapsed so completely. It is the lowest point the nation has ever reached, and the obvious question hanging over the wreckage is whether a promise this old and this battered could really have anything left in it at all. And yet, if you've been paying attention to how this story tends to work, you'll notice something. Every time things have looked utterly finished, back in the garden, in the flood, in the slavery, at the edge of the land, a flicker of promise has survived in the ashes. The nation has been reduced to almost nothing before, and each time the thread refused to snap. So while the exiles sit by foreign rivers mourning everything they've lost, convinced the story is over, the reader who's been tracking that stubborn promise since the very first page has reason to suspect this collapse. Devastating as it is, might not be the ending at all. It might just be the darkest point before the story figures out how to rebuild, which is exactly the question the next stretch sets out to answer. Sitting in a foreign land with your city burned, your temple gone, and your king in chains, you'd be forgiven for assuming the story was well and truly over. That's certainly how it felt to the people dragged off into captivity. And yet, in one of the quieter surprises of the whole collection, The exile turned out to be not an ending, but a strange kind of workshop, a place where the shattered nation began, of all things, to write. Because the most pressing danger for a conquered people isn't just the loss of their land or their leaders, it's the slow erasure of memory, the very real possibility that within a generation or two nobody would remember who they'd been at all. And so, sitting in the wreckage, someone picked up a pen and started the enormous task of making sure they didn't forget. The result is a pair of books that retell the entire history from the very beginning, all the way back to the first man, right up through the era of the kings we just watched collapse. On the surface, this seems redundant, a rerun of events the reader has already sat through, and it's easy to wonder why the story would bother recapping itself. But these books aren't a simple replay. They're history written with a very particular purpose for a very particular audience, a people who had lost everything and desperately needed reminding of who they were. So the retelling is selective, lingering lovingly on the golden shepherd king and the magnificent temple and all the details of proper worship, and quietly skimming past the more embarrassing chapters. It's the version of the family history you'd tell to remind everyone what the family's supposed to stand for, emphasizing the proud moments to rekindle a sense of identity in people who'd started to feel like they had none. There's a deeper thread running underneath it too, one that reaches all the way back to the opening pages. By starting the whole retelling with the very first human, and then tracing the line forward through the worship, the temple, and the presence of God among his people, the books quietly make a much bigger point than mere nostalgia. They're arguing that the plan was always the same from the beginning, that the entire arc of history has been about God working to dwell in the middle of humanity, and that a temporary catastrophe, however brutal, doesn't cancel a plan that old and that persistent. For an audience convinced they'd been abandoned, that's an enormous claim to make, and the books make it not with a dramatic speech but with the patient cumulative weight of the whole story laid out end to end. These books also open with something that has defeated more enthusiastic reading plans than perhaps any other passage in the entire library, which is roughly 9 straight chapters of genealogy. Name after name after name, an unbroken river of ancestors stretching from the dawn of humanity forward through the generations, and if you've ever tried to read it aloud, you know it's the ancient equivalent of scrolling through someone's entire contact list out of context. But there's a point buried in all those names, and it's a moving one. For a scattered, displaced people, a family tree is proof that they exist, proof that the line running all the way back to the beginning hadn't been snapped by the catastrophe. Every name is a small act of defiance against the erasure the exile threatened. The genealogy is essentially the nation insisting, in the most tedious way imaginable, that it was still here, still connected to its own beginning, still part of a plan that stretched back to the first pages. Whether that makes the reading any easier is another question entirely. But it's worth pausing on the strangeness of it, that a people at their lowest possible moment chose to begin their great work of memory, not with a rousing speech, but with a meticulous list of who was descended from whom. For a nation that had every reason to believe it was the end of the line, compiling one anyway was its own quiet act of faith. Then, just when the situation looks permanently hopeless, the geopolitical weather changes, as it has a habit of doing. The empire that had crushed them gets crushed in turn by a rising new power from the east, the Persians, and the new emperor turns out to have a startlingly different policy toward conquered peoples. Rather than keeping everyone displaced and demoralized, this ruler, named Cyrus, issues a formal decree allowing the exiles to pack up and return to their homeland to rebuild, and, remarkably, offers to help fund the reconstruction of their temple. This is not the sort of gesture conquering emperors are typically remembered for. Sending a subjugated people home with a construction budget was wildly generous by the standards of the era, and the return becomes the great hopeful turning point after the long night of captivity. What makes it more striking is that not everyone actually wanted to go. Several generations had now been born in exile, and for many of them the foreign land was the only home they'd ever known. With established lives, businesses, and comforts, they weren't eager to abandon for a long, dangerous journey to a ruined city they'd only heard about in stories. So the return happened in waves, smaller groups of the committed making the trek over many years rather than one grand triumphant procession, which is a rather realistic detail. Freedom, it turns out, is one thing, and actually uprooting your life to use it is quite another. The 3 characters we've been tracking, separated so violently, suddenly have a chance to be reunited, the people heading back toward the land, the possibility of God dwelling among them once more, at least for those willing to make the trip. The rebuilding, it turns out, comes in two distinct flavours, handled by two different books and two very different leaders. The first is concerned with restoring the people on the inside, their worship and their spiritual life. A scholar and teacher devoted to the ancient law leads a group of returnees back and oversees the reconstruction of the temple, and it's here we get one of the collection's most bittersweet little moments. When the foundation of the new temple is laid, the crowd's reaction is split down the middle. The younger people, who never saw the original, cheer with joy, while the elderly, who remembered the breathtaking grandeur of the temple that was destroyed, weep openly, because this humbler replacement is such a come-down from the glory they recalled. So the sound of celebration and the sound of grief rise up together and blend into a single noise, nobody able to tell where one ends and the other begins. It's the emotional reality of any rebuild after a loss, the new thing being genuinely good and genuinely not the same all at once. The book also deals honestly with the fact that returning home didn't magically fix everyone's behaviour, and the people had to be called back, sometimes uncomfortably, from the compromises they'd drifted into. The temple rebuild itself was no smooth affair either. The neighbouring peoples who'd moved into the region during the exile were not thrilled to see the old inhabitants returning and reasserting themselves, and they managed to stall the whole project for years through a mix of intimidation and bureaucratic sabotage, sending complaints to the imperial authorities in an effort to get the work shut down on paper. It took fresh encouragement and a renewed royal decree to finally get the construction moving again, and even then the finished result was that humbler building the old-timers wept over. Progress in this stretch of the story is never clean or fast. It comes in fits and starts, against constant resistance, which is probably the most honest depiction of rebuilding after a disaster that anyone could offer. The second flavour of rebuilding is far more physical, and comes with considerably more drama. A high-ranking official serving in the Persian court, a man who happened to be an exile himself, hears that the returned community back home is defenceless, its protective city walls still lying in rubble, leaving the people exposed and demoralised. He gets permission to travel home and organise the reconstruction of those walls, and what follows is one of the more inspiring project management stories you'll ever read, which is a sentence I never expected to write. The local officials in the surrounding regions, who rather liked having a weak and vulnerable neighbour, do everything they can to sabotage the work, starting with relentless mockery, sneering that the wall would be so flimsy a small animal could knock it over, and escalating to actual threats of violence when the ridicule fails to stop the momentum. The response to those threats is the detail everyone remembers. The workers keep building, but they build armed, with a tool in one hand and a weapon within reach, half the crew constructing while the other half stands guard, everyone ready to drop the shovel and defend the site at a moment's notice. It's construction under siege, and against every expectation the wall gets finished in a startlingly short span of time, fast enough that the enemies who'd been so confident of failure are left thoroughly demoralised, realising the work had been accomplished with a kind of determination they hadn't accounted for. And once the physical walls are up and the city is secure, the scholarly teacher from the first book gathers the whole population together and reads the ancient law aloud to them, publicly, for hours, reconnecting the people with the foundational text many of them had never properly heard. The wall itself, remarkably, went up in just 52 days, a timeline so brisk that even the hostile neighbours had to grudgingly admit something unusual was behind it. But the official's toughest fight wasn't actually with the enemies outside the walls. Partway through the project, he discovered that the community's own wealthy members were exploiting their struggling neighbours, charging crushing interest and effectively forcing poorer families into debt slavery, just as they were trying to rebuild together. He was furious, and he confronted the exploiters publicly, demanding they return what they'd taken and stop bleeding their own people dry. It's a pointed reminder that a community can survive every external threat and still rot from the inside if the people within it turn on each other, and that rebuilding walls means nothing if you don't also rebuild basic fairness, physical security and spiritual renewal arriving together, the outside and the inside of the community both rebuilt at last. The historical section closes with a book unlike anything around it, a tense, dramatic story set entirely within the glittering and dangerous world of the Persian royal court, far from the homeland. It follows a young woman, an orphan raised by her older cousin, who through a series of events ends up chosen as the new queen of the empire, keeping her ethnic background a carefully guarded secret. Trouble arrives in the form of a scheming, power-hungry official who, enraged by a personal slight from the queen's cousin, hatches a plan to wipe out the Queen's entire people across the whole empire, manipulating the king into signing the order without realizing who it would doom. The cousin gets word to the Queen and urges her to intervene, pointing out in one of the story's most famous lines that perhaps she had reached her royal position for exactly such a moment as this. What follows is a masterclass in dramatic irony and nerve. The Queen risks her own life by approaching the king uninvited, a move that could have gotten her executed on the spot, and through a patient, well-timed strategy, she exposes the villain's plot at exactly the right moment. In a twist so satisfying it feels almost scripted, the elaborate execution device the villain had built for his intended victim ends up being the very thing he's destroyed on, hoisted, as the saying goes, entirely by his own petard. The whole downfall unfolds through a beautifully constructed sequence of well-timed banquets, the Queen patiently hosting the king and the villain together, drawing out the tension across multiple feasts before finally springing the truth at precisely the right instant, when the king's favour was highest and the villain's guard was lowest. Meanwhile, in one of those perfect small ironies, the villain is forced to publicly honour the very man he despises most, after the king happens to read the palace records one sleepless night and discovers that the Queen's cousin had once foiled an assassination plot and was never rewarded. Every piece falls into place with uncanny precision. The Queen's people are saved, the threat is reversed, and the whole rescue is commemorated by a festival still celebrated to this day, a raucous, joyful holiday marking the moment certain doom flipped into deliverance. But here's the detail that makes the book genuinely unique in the entire collection, and it's easy to miss. God is never once mentioned, not a single time. There are no miracles, no divine voices, no burning bushes, nothing overtly supernatural at all. And yet the entire story is so laced with impossibly well-timed coincidences, the right person in the right place at the right moment again and again, that the point becomes unmistakable. Sometimes the divine hand works not through thunder and fire, but through quiet, invisible providence, arranging events behind the scenes while never showing its face. It's a book about how God can be utterly present even when he appears to be completely absent, which is a comforting thought for anyone who's ever felt like their prayers were vanishing into silence. And with that, the long historical spine of the collection comes to a close. Take stock of where the story has landed. The people are back in their homeland, the land is being resettled. A temple stands again, humbler than before but real. The city walls are up. The ancient law is being read aloud once more. After the total devastation of the exile, the three characters have edged back toward one another, and the scene is quietly, patiently set for the arrival of that promised rescuer the whole thing has been building towards since the very first garden. The narrative essentially pauses here, holding its breath, waiting. It's worth sitting with just how far the story has travelled to reach this point. It opened in a perfect garden, watched that harmony shatter, followed one family through slavery and rescue, built a nation, gave it a law, won it a homeland, raised it to a golden kingdom, watched that kingdom split and rot and burn, dragged its people into exile, and then, against every expectation, brought a remnant of them home to start again. That's an enormous arc, full of failure and recovery, and through every single collapse the one constant has been that stubborn promise refusing to die. Now, with the people home and the stage reset, that promise has never felt closer to paying off. But before we walk into that waiting, we need to step off the timeline entirely and visit a completely different part of the library, because running alongside all this history is another whole shelf of writing that deals not with what happened, but with what it felt like to be a human being in the middle of it all. These next books aren't a continuation of the plot, so don't come looking for the next chapter of the story here. Instead, they're the emotional and philosophical core of the whole collection. 5 books that step back from kings and battles and ask the deeper questions that every person eventually runs into, regardless of which century they happen to be born in. It helps to think of the library's layout not as a strict timeline, but as different rooms in the same house. We've just finished walking through the long hallway of history, the room where things happen in order, one event after another. Now, we're stepping into a different room entirely, one where time slows down and the focus shifts from the march of events to the interior weather of the people living through them. These books were written across many of the same centuries we just covered, woven right alongside the history rather than after it, which is why the mood shift can feel abrupt if you don't know to expect it. Where the history books tell you what the nation did, these books tell you what the human heart does when it stands in front of God with all its confusion, grief, joy, and longing laid bare. They are, in a sense, the most timeless part of the entire library, because while empires and kings come and go, the experience of suffering, of searching for meaning, of falling in love, and of wanting to make sense of a chaotic world never really changes. The first of them tackles the oldest and hardest question there is, and it's fittingly one of the most ancient pieces of writing in the whole collection, likely older than most of the history we just covered. It centres on a genuinely good man, prosperous and upright, who has done nothing to deserve what's about to happen to him. Behind the scenes, in a conversation the man himself never hears about, a cynical accusing figure challenges the idea that anyone is ever truly good for its own sake, suggesting the man only honours God because his life is comfortable, and betting that if you stripped away all his blessings he'd curse God in a heartbeat. This framing is one of the most quietly unsettling setups in the whole collection, because it means the man suffers without ever being told why, while the reader watches from a vantage point he'll never share. We know the test is happening, he doesn't. That gap is the entire engine of the book, and it's what makes his refusal to curse God so powerful, because he holds on to his integrity with absolutely no idea that anything is being proven through him at all. Permission is granted to test the theory, and in a devastating stretch the man loses nearly everything: his wealth, his livelihood, his health, and worst of all his children, one catastrophe piling onto the next until he's left sitting in the ashes of his former life in agony with no explanation offered. Then his friends show up, and here the book does something psychologically brilliant. For 7 days they get it exactly right, simply sitting with him in silence, sharing his grief without saying a word, which is genuinely the correct response to unspeakable loss. And then they open their mouths, and it all falls apart. Convinced that suffering must always be a punishment for wrongdoing, they spend chapter after chapter insisting that their friend must have secretly done something terrible to deserve all this, because in their tidy view of the universe, good people prosper and bad people suffer, full stop. Their comfort curdles into accusation, and their confident bad theology becomes its own kind of torture, piled on top of everything else the poor man is already enduring. It's a painfully accurate portrait of how people often respond to someone else's tragedy, rushing to explain it in a way that lets them feel safe, rather than sitting in the uncomfortable mystery of it. The man himself refuses to accept their neat explanations, insisting on his innocence and demanding with mounting frustration that God explain what on earth is going on. And when the answer finally comes, delivered out of a raging storm, it is not at all what anyone expects. God doesn't provide a tidy explanation for the suffering. Instead, he responds with an overwhelming series of questions of his own, sweeping across the vastness and wildness of creation, asking whether the man was there when the foundations of the world were laid, whether he commands the dawn or understands the deep. It's less an answer to the question of suffering, and more a complete reframing of it, a reminder of the sheer scale of what the man doesn't and can't comprehend. The resolution in the end isn't an explanation at all, it's a matter of trust, of choosing to rest in the character of a God whose ways are bigger than any single person's ability to grasp, even when the reasons remain hidden. It's not the satisfying answer we'd all like about why bad things happen to good people, but it may be the most honest one anyone's ever put on paper. The book does close with a measure of restoration, the man's fortunes eventually rebuilt, and his later years filled with more than he'd lost, but the collection is careful not to present this as a simple reward that ties everything up with a bow. The restored blessings don't erase the children he grieved or explain the anguish he went through. They simply affirm that the story wasn't over at its lowest point, and that a life can hold both terrible loss and eventual renewal without the one cancelling out the other. Notably, the friends who spent so long confidently explaining the suffering are told at the end that they got it wrong, while the man who dared to question and argue and demand answers is the one who spoke rightly. There's a quiet vindication there for honest wrestling over tidy piety, an endorsement of the person who brings his real anguish and doubt to God, rather than the ones who defend God with comfortable clichés at someone else's expense. From the depths of suffering, the collection moves to a book that contains the full spectrum of human emotion, and it's the single largest book in the entire library, a vast collection of 150 songs and prayers gathered over centuries. Think of it as the nation's hymn book, and prayer journal rolled into one, organised into 5 sections, and covering absolutely every mood a person can bring before God. This is the crucial thing about it, and it surprises people who expect sacred writing to be all reverence and politeness. A huge portion of these songs are raw, unfiltered complaints, people crying out in anguish, demanding to know how long they'll have to suffer, even accusing God of seeming distant or asleep. The book gives full permission to be brutally honest with the divine, to show up angry and confused and afraid, which is a far cry from the tidy, filtered version of faith many people assume they're supposed to perform. If you've ever wanted to yell at the sky, this book demonstrates that plenty of people got there first and wrote it down. But the overall movement of the collection, across all 5 sections, is a gradual arc from lament toward praise, from tears toward trust, ending in a final burst of pure, unrestrained celebration, several songs in a row that are essentially nothing but joyful shouting. Many of these songs were composed by the Shepherd King himself, drawing on a life that swung wildly between triumph and disaster, which is why they ring so true across every kind of experience. The 5 sections, incidentally, are widely thought to deliberately mirror the 5 books of the ancient law that open the whole collection. A bit of intentional architecture that suggests the songs were meant as a kind of companion for living out that law from the heart. And the songs come in recognizable varieties once you start noticing them. There are the desperate laments already mentioned, but also songs of pure thanksgiving after a rescue, songs celebrating the king and his throne, songs marveling at creation, and reflective songs chewing over how to live wisely. Learning to spot which kind you're reading transforms the experience from a confusing jumble into something you can actually navigate. Scattered throughout are songs that seem to reach beyond their own moment and point forward to that promised rescuer, describing a suffering figure abandoned and mocked, and elsewhere a triumphant coming king, in language later readers would find almost eerily specific. These forward-pointing songs became some of the most quoted passages in everything that followed, little signposts planted centuries early. What's remarkable about this whole collection is how thoroughly it escaped its own time. These weren't songs meant to sit in an archive. They were written to be sung, prayed, and returned to again and again, and that's exactly what happened, for thousands of years and across countless languages, right up to the present. People in hospital rooms, in prisons, in moments of grief and moments of overwhelming gratitude have reached for these ancient words and found that someone, millennia ago, had already put their exact feeling into language. That staying power is the real testament to the book. Emotions don't have an expiration date, and neither, it turns out, do the words that capture them honestly. There's also a recurring love for the ancient lore, celebrated as a delight rather than a burden. Most famously in the collection's longest single song, an enormous, meticulously structured poem built as an alphabetical acrostic, each section beginning with the successive letters of the alphabet, an elaborate feat of craftsmanship devoted entirely to the beauty of divine instruction. It is, depending on your perspective, either a stunning act of devotion or the ancient equivalent of the world's most ambitious homework assignment, and honestly it's both. Next comes the collection's practical wisdom manual, a book of short, punchy sayings mostly attributed to that famously wise king from the Golden Age, designed to teach a person how to actually live well day to day. Its foundational principle, stated right at the start, is that real knowledge begins with a deep reverence for God, the idea being that you can't think clearly about anything until you've got your fundamental orientation right. From there, the book personifies wisdom itself as a woman standing in the public square, calling out to anyone who'll listen, offering a life of insight and good sense, and contrasted against a rival figure representing folly, who offers easy pleasures that lead nowhere good. It's a clever bit of imagery, casting the whole of life as a choice between 2 voices competing for your attention on a crowded street, one promising slow, unglamorous growth, and the other promising instant gratification with the fine print carefully hidden. Anyone who has ever been pulled between the responsible option and the tempting shortcut already knows this street intimately, which is precisely why the image has lasted. The bulk of the book is a rapid-fire stream of extremely practical advice on money, on watching what comes out of your mouth, on choosing friends, on avoiding laziness, on family life, the sort of grounded, down-to-earth counsel that feels almost startlingly modern. Much of it reads like the accumulated common sense of someone who has watched a lot of people make a lot of predictable mistakes and would very much like to spare you the trouble. Running underneath all the individual sayings is a simple organizing idea. The notion of two diverging paths laid out before every person, one of wisdom that leads steadily toward life and flourishing, and one of foolishness that looks appealing in the moment, but quietly leads toward ruin. The whole book is essentially an extended argument for choosing the first path, made not through threats, but through the sheer accumulated evidence of how life actually tends to work. A gentle answer diffuses anger while a harsh word stirs it up. A little laziness now becomes poverty later, as reliably as a season turning. Guarding your tongue saves you more trouble than almost any other habit. None of it is glamorous, and that's rather the point. Wisdom, the book insists, isn't some mystical secret but a collection of unglamorous teachable habits that compound over a lifetime, and the earlier you start practicing them, the better your odds. It closes with a detailed and admiring portrait of a capable, industrious woman who manages a household, runs businesses, and provides for her family with skill and strength. A striking celebration of competence that stands out sharply against the assumptions people often bring to ancient texts. Then, the mood shifts dramatically, because the next book is essentially the existential crisis of the collection, the one you'd expect to find scrawled in a journal at 3 a.m. Written from the perspective of someone who has tried absolutely everything the world has to offer in search of meaning, pleasure, wealth, achievement, wisdom, endless projects, the whole menu, it arrives at a bleak and repeated verdict. It's all fleeting, insubstantial, like breath or vapour or a chasing after the wind, gone the moment you try to grasp it. The author, having sampled every possible source of fulfillment, keeps circling back to the uncomfortable truth that death eventually levels everyone, the wise and the foolish alike, and that so much of what people frantically pursue amounts to very little in the end. It's a book that stares straight into life's apparent meaninglessness without flinching, which makes it startlingly relatable to anyone who's ever felt the ground drop out from under their sense of purpose. A recurring phrase frames the whole meditation, the idea of everything happening under the sun, which is the author's way of describing life viewed purely on its own terms, without reference to anything beyond the immediate horizon. Looked at that way, from ground level, so much of human striving really does start to feel like running on a treadmill. The book also contains one of the most quoted passages in the entire collection, a rhythmic meditation on how there's a season and a time for everything under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to hold on and a time to let go. It's a strangely calming acknowledgement that life moves in cycles nobody fully controls, that the good times and the hard times each have their moment and each will pass, and that fighting the rhythm is its own kind of futility. And yet, the book doesn't end in despair. After all the disillusionment, it lands on a quiet, grounded conclusion, that the point isn't to solve everything but to enjoy the simple gifts of daily life, your food, your work, your relationships, as genuine gifts, and to hold God in reverent awe and live accordingly. It's the philosophy of someone who went looking for the meaning of life, came up empty on the grand cosmic answer, and discovered that the ordinary moments were the treasure all along. There's something oddly freeing in that conclusion, and it's aged remarkably well. In an age obsessed with optimizing, achieving, and chasing the next big thing, a very old book quietly pointing out that the frantic pursuit mostly leads nowhere, and that a shared meal and honest work and a bit of reverence might be closer to the point, reads less like ancient pessimism and more like advice we keep needing to relearn. The author isn't telling you to stop living. He's telling you to stop expecting your accomplishments to bear a weight they were never built to carry, and to receive the small, good, passing gifts of an ordinary day for exactly what they are. The final book of this emotional section catches almost everyone off guard, because it's a frank, unabashed celebration of romantic love between two people, and it does not hold back. Written as a series of poems passing back and forth between two lovers, it lingers on longing, attraction, and the delight the two take in one another, all rendered in lush, imaginative, occasionally eyebrow-raising poetic imagery drawn from gardens, spices, and the natural world. Its inclusion in a sacred collection has surprised and mildly scandalized readers for a very long time, and generations of commentators have tied themselves in knots, trying to explain it away as purely symbolic. Some read it as an extended metaphor for the love between God and his people, and that reading has a long and respectable history, offering a picture of a devotion that's passionate rather than merely dutiful. But most readers today are comfortable letting it be what it plainly appears to be first and foremost, which is unashamed poetry about human love. The two readings aren't even really in competition, since a story that elsewhere describes God walking with people in a garden and longing to dwell among them clearly has no problem treating love itself as sacred territory. But taken at face value, its message is refreshingly clear and countercultural for any era. Love, attraction, and intimacy between committed partners are not something shameful to be whispered about or hidden away, but a genuine and beautiful gift woven into creation by its designer, meant to be celebrated rather than apologized for. In a collection full of laws and warnings and heavy theology, it's a reminder that the same story also makes room for joy, tenderness, and the simple wonder of two people delighting in each other. Taken together, these 5 books get anchored, if you're keeping up with our Australian menagerie, by the kookaburra. The bird famous for a distinctive call that sounds unmistakably like raucous, rolling laughter echoing through the trees. It's the perfect creature for this section, because that laugh contains multitudes. It can sound joyful, or slightly unhinged, or oddly mournful depending on the moment, and that emotional range is exactly what these books are about. The full spectrum of the human experience, the suffering of the ashes, the crying and the celebrating of the songs, the hard-won practical wisdom, the existential ache, and the delight of love, all of it carried honestly before God. Where the history books showed us a nation's outer journey through triumph and collapse, these 5 turn the camera inward and show us the inner life of the people living through it, every raw and contradictory feeling given permission to exist. Keep that laughing bird in mind, because it captures the surprising truth that this ancient collection isn't just a record of events and rules. It's also, at its heart, deeply and unapologetically human, holding space for every emotion a person could possibly carry, and insisting that all of it, the joy and the grief alike, belongs in the conversation. And with the emotional core of the library now behind us, the human heart mapped out in all its contradictions, there's one more major genre waiting on the shelf before the long historical narrative finally goes quiet, because running throughout all those centuries of kings and collapse, alongside the songs and the wisdom, was another group of voices entirely, people who showed up uninvited to tell the nation the hard truths nobody wanted to hear. They warned, they wept, they thundered, and occasionally they did genuinely bizarre things to get the point across. They are the prophets, and they're where the story turns next, carrying the promised thread forward toward its long-awaited resolution, while the world around them steadily falls apart. Before we meet these voices individually, it's worth understanding what a prophet actually was, because the modern picture is almost entirely wrong. People tend to imagine a prophet as a kind of mystical fortune-teller peering into a crystal ball to predict the future, and while these figures did sometimes speak about things to come, that was never the main job. A prophet was closer to a whistleblower, an appointed messenger who showed up, usually without an invitation, and almost always without a warm welcome, to tell the nation and its leaders that they had drifted badly off course and needed to turn around before it was too late. It was, to put it mildly, not a role with attractive career prospects. Announcing to powerful people that they've lost the plot and disaster is coming has never been a great way to win friends, and most of these messengers were ignored, mocked, threatened, or worse. Their message tended to come in 2 parts that seem contradictory until you sit with them. First, the bad news, a hard warning that judgment was coming because of how far the people had strayed. And second, tucked in behind the warning, a stubborn thread of hope, the promise that beyond the coming disaster there was still a future, still that ancient rescue plan quietly moving forward. These figures operated all through the centuries of decline, collapse, exile, and return we've already walked through, which is why their words keep bumping up against events we've seen. They were the running commentary on the whole slow-motion tragedy, insisting the entire time that it didn't have to end this way. It helps to picture their role in legal terms, because that's often exactly how their speeches were framed. The nation had entered into a formal agreement with God generations earlier, back at that smoking mountain, complete with promises on both sides and clearly stated consequences for breaking faith. The prophets, then, functioned something like prosecuting attorneys, showing up to read the charges aloud, to remind everyone of the terms they'd signed on to, and to spell out what was coming if the pattern didn't change. This is why their messages so often sound like an argument being made in court, complete with evidence, witnesses called from the natural world, and a verdict. It also explains why they were so despised. Nobody enjoys the person who arrives to remind them of the fine print they've been happily ignoring, especially when that person is usually right. And they rarely got to choose the assignment. A recurring feature of these books is the reluctant beginning, the ordinary person insisting they're the wrong choice, too young, too clumsy of speech, too unwilling, only to be told the job wasn't optional. The first and most towering of them is a book so vast in scope and so soaring in its language that it's sometimes described as a miniature version of the entire collection folded into a single volume. Part of what earns it that reputation is a detail almost too neat to be accidental. The book contains exactly 66 chapters, the same number as the books in the whole library, and it even divides into two large movements that echo the collection's own two halves, a first section heavy with warning and judgment, and a second section overflowing with comfort and hope. Whether that structure was deliberate or a happy coincidence, it's tidy enough to make you slightly suspicious. The first movement delivers stern verdicts, not just against the prophet's own people for their corruption and empty religious performance, but against a whole lineup of surrounding nations who thought they were untouchable. Nobody gets a pass. The prophet's opening indictment is blistering, comparing the nation to a vineyard its owner had planted with every care and every advantage, only to have it produce sour, worthless fruit despite all that investment. A heartbreaking image of squandered potential. He also has a habit of puncturing human arrogance wherever he finds it, mocking the pride of mighty kings and empires who imagine themselves permanent, and reminding them that from a certain height entire nations look like a drop in a bucket or fine dust on a scale. But it's the second movement that made this book beloved for thousands of years, because it contains some of the most breathtaking visions of hope anywhere in the collection. Chief among them is a haunting portrait of a mysterious figure, a servant who suffers terribly, who is rejected and crushed and pierced, not for anything he himself did wrong, but somehow on behalf of others, bearing their failures so they could go free. It appears most fully in the book's 53rd chapter, and it's written with such specificity and emotional weight that later readers found it almost impossible not to see a particular someone in it, someone who hadn't arrived yet when the words were written. But that suffering servant is only one of several forward-pointing visions the book is famous for. Elsewhere it describes the birth of a child who would carry the government on his shoulders and be given titles no ordinary king could bear, a ruler whose reign of peace would never end. And it paints an unforgettable picture of a restored world where natural enemies lie down together in harmony, a wolf resting beside a lamb, a child playing unharmed near a snake, all the ancient hostilities dissolved, the closest thing to a return to that first garden that any of the prophets dared to imagine. The book also paints a dazzling picture of a renewed city, and ultimately a whole new creation, a world where the old sorrows are undone. And here's where a detail we touched on much earlier becomes genuinely important. Among those ancient scrolls discovered in the desert caves, the ones that stunned scholars by matching much later copies so closely, was a nearly complete copy of this very book, hundreds of years older than anything previously available. That discovery put to rest any suggestion that the striking servant passage had been quietly edited in, after the fact to match events, because there it was, sitting in the sand, written long before the person it seemed to describe had ever walked the earth. The next of the great voices belongs to a man who has come to be known, fairly enough, as the Weeping Prophet, and once you know his story, the nickname makes perfect sense. He spent roughly 40 years faithfully delivering an unpopular warning to a nation determined not to listen. And unlike some of his colleagues, he never got the satisfaction of watching his audience come around. Not once. Imagine dedicating 4 decades of your life to telling people that catastrophe was coming, being completely correct, and receiving in return nothing but ridicule, imprisonment, and at one low point being lowered into a muddy pit and left there. Being right, in this profession, came with absolutely no reward and a great deal of punishment, which is a raw deal by any measure. He predicted in painful detail that a mighty empire from the east would sweep in and conquer the city, and he lived to see the whole grim prophecy come true, watching the capital burn and its people dragged away exactly as he'd warned. He'd been called to this thankless work as a young man, protesting that he was far too inexperienced to speak, and the decades that followed proved just how brutal the assignment would be. At one point he dictated his warnings onto a scroll and had it read aloud to the king, who responded by calmly slicing off the pages a few at a time and feeding them into a fire until the entire document was gone, which is one way to deal with feedback you don't like. The prophet simply dictated the whole thing again. He also spent much of his career competing against a chorus of cheerful, popular voices telling the people exactly what they wanted to hear, that everything was fine, that no disaster was coming, that peace was assured. These crowd-pleasing optimists were far more welcome than he was, right up until the moment his gloomy predictions turned out to be the accurate ones, which is a lesson about the difference between comfortable messages and true ones. It's a genuinely tragic career, a man whose deepest wish was for his own predictions to be wrong. And yet even he carried the hope thread, promising that beyond the wreckage God would one day make a fresh kind of agreement with his people, one written not on stone tablets, but directly onto human hearts, an internal transformation rather than an external rulebook. Directly connected to that same catastrophe is a small, intense book of grief, essentially a collection of funeral poems mourning the destroyed city. It's a raw howl of anguish over the loss of everything, and it does something structurally remarkable in the middle of all that pain. The poems are built as tight alphabetical acrostics, each section marching through the letters of the alphabet in order, which is a striking choice, because it means the writer channeled overwhelming sorrow into an extremely disciplined, ordered form. There's something profoundly human in that, the impulse to impose structure on grief precisely because everything else has fallen apart. And right at the very centre of this book of tears, positioned almost like the hinge the whole thing turns on, comes the single brightest ray of hope, the quiet insistence that despite the devastation, divine compassion has not run out, that his mercies are fresh and new every single morning, and that his faithfulness is great. It's the darkest book in the collection with the most luminous heart, hope shining brightest at the exact point where despair is deepest. The imagery throughout is unflinching, describing the once proud city now sitting alone like a widow, her streets empty, her people scattered and starving, a place that had been the envy of the region reduced to a byword for ruin. The writer holds nothing back about the horror of what happened and refuses to pretend it wasn't devastating, which is precisely what makes the flash of hope at the centre feel earned rather than cheap. This is not a book that reaches for comfort too quickly. It sits in the rubble first, and only from inside that honest grief does it dare to whisper that the story might not be over. Then comes what might be the strangest book in the entire library, and that's saying something. If the other prophets preached, this one performed, and his performances were the kind that would get a full documentary treatment today. Stationed among the exiles in the foreign land, he received a series of wildly vivid, almost hallucinatory visions, opening with an elaborate description of a heavenly chariot covered in wheels and eyes, and impossible living creatures that reads like the fever dream it probably felt like to write. And he didn't just describe things, he acted them out in elaborate, physically demanding public demonstrations, lying on his side for an astonishingly long stretch of time as a living symbol, and staging other sign acts that must have made him quite the local spectacle, a level of commitment to the message that no modern performance artist has come close to matching. Beneath all the surreal imagery, though, his message was pointed. His most famous vision drops him into a valley littered with dry bones which then rattle together, grow flesh, and come back to life. A stunning picture of a nation that felt utterly dead being promised new life. He carried a beautiful promise that God would replace his people's cold, stony hearts with warm, living ones and place a new spirit inside them, and he closed with a detailed vision of a future temple, a clear signal that the goal had never changed, that the whole long story was still driving toward God dwelling right in the middle of his people again. One of the book's most devastating images comes earlier, when the prophet watches, in a vision, the very presence of God slowly and reluctantly departing from the doomed temple before its destruction, lifting away from the city as if grieving to leave. It's the story's darkest possible development, the three characters torn apart at the deepest level, the divine presence itself withdrawing, which is exactly what makes that closing vision of a new temple, where the glory comes flooding back in to stay, land with such force. The book was also handed a sobering job description along the way, appointed as a kind of watchman posted on the city wall, responsible for sounding the alarm when danger approached, and warned that staying silent while people walked toward disaster would make him partly responsible for the outcome. It's a heavy weight to put on a messenger, and it explains the urgency that crackles through even his strangest visions. The last of the major voices is set squarely in that foreign court of exile, and it follows a young man of remarkable integrity trying to stay faithful while serving at the highest levels of a pagan empire, which was a bit like trying to keep your principles intact while working for a boss who occasionally demands to be worshipped. He establishes that integrity right at the start, in a low-key way that sets the tone for everything after. Selected for elite training in the imperial court, he politely but firmly declines to eat the rich royal food that would compromise his convictions, proposing a modest test diet instead, and coming out healthier than everyone who feasted. A small act of quiet resistance that says a great deal about his character. It's the pattern the whole book runs on: faithfulness in small things, preparing the ground for faithfulness under far greater pressure later. The book is famous for its dramatic survival stories. 3 of his companions refuse to bow to a giant golden statue and get thrown into a blazing furnace, only to walk out completely unharmed, without even the smell of smoke on their clothes, which is the ancient equivalent of strolling out of a house fire and not needing to change your shirt. The man himself is later tossed into a den of hungry lions for the crime of continuing to prey, and survives the night untouched, the lions apparently having lost their appetite at the worst possible moment for his enemies. But the book is more than a collection of miraculous escapes. It's also packed with sweeping visions and dream interpretations that map out the rise and fall of successive empires across the centuries, arranged in an elegant mirror structure where the first half and second half reflect each other. The most famous of these begins when the foreign emperor has a troubling dream about an enormous statue made of different metals, gold at the top grading down to clay at the feet, and the young man explains that the descending materials represent a sequence of kingdoms that would rise and fall one after another until a final everlasting kingdom, pictured as a stone that smashes the statue, would outlast them all. On another memorable night, a later ruler throwing a lavish banquet is interrupted by a disembodied hand writing mysterious words on the wall, a scene so striking it gave us a phrase we still use for an obvious sign of impending doom, and the young man is summoned to decode the message, which turns out to be an announcement that the king's time was up that very night. And buried in those visions is a startlingly specific prediction about the timing of the promised one's arrival, a countdown of sorts, laid out in a sequence of set periods with a precision that later readers found impossible to ignore, as though someone had circled a date on a calendar centuries in advance. These 5 thundering voices get anchored in our running menagerie by a boxing kangaroo, and the image is almost too perfect once you understand how the prophets operated. A boxing kangaroo does 2 things. It squares up and throws a warning, and then, if the warning goes unheeded, it delivers the punch. That's the prophetic rhythm exactly. First the warning, sometimes for decades, pleading with the people to change course before the blow lands, and then, when the warnings are ignored one time too many, the judgment arrives with full force. Keep that image of the kangaroo in your mind, fists up, because it captures the whole 2-part nature of these books, the mercy of the warning and the seriousness of the consequence, wrapped together in one improbably muscular marsupial. And notice that the warning always comes first, sometimes years or decades of it, patient and repeated, which quietly reveals something about the character behind the judgment. A god eager only to punish wouldn't bother sending warning after warning. The very existence of the prophets, pleading and pleading before any blow lands, is itself a kind of mercy, an extended invitation to change course that keeps being offered long after most would have given up on it. The punch, when it finally comes, arrives only after the warning has been ignored past the point of reason. Alongside those 5 heavyweights sits a group of 12 shorter books, and the label they usually get, the minor prophets, has caused a lot of unnecessary confusion, so let's clear it up right away. Minor here has nothing to do with importance, and everything to do with length. These books are shorter, some of them dramatically so, and that's the only sense in which they're minor. In fact, in the older arrangement of these texts, all 12 were written together on a single scroll and counted as one book, a kind of anthology of shorter voices bundled for convenience. Each one still packs a distinct punch, and together they cover an enormous range of tone, from the heartbroken to the furious to the outright comedic. They're also spread across a wide span of time, some shouting warnings before the Great Collapse, some picking through the rubble afterward, and a few speaking to the returned community trying to rebuild, so reading them in order is a bit like flipping through a family's letters from very different decades, each one written into its own moment of crisis or hope. Don't let the brevity fool you into skimming past them, because some of the most quoted and most piercing lines in the entire collection are tucked into these compact little books. The collection opens with a book that asks its prophet to do something almost unthinkable in the name of making a point. He's instructed to marry a woman who he knows will be unfaithful to him, and then to keep loving her and taking her back even after she repeatedly betrays him and walks away. It's an agonizing assignment, and it's meant to be, because his miserable marriage becomes a living, breathing metaphor for the relationship between God and his people. Every time the wife strays, it mirrors the nation chasing after other gods, and every time the heartbroken husband pursues her and welcomes her home anyway, it dramatizes a divine love so stubborn and unreasonable that it refuses to give up on an unfaithful partner. It's a deeply uncomfortable book, and that discomfort is entirely the point. This is what betrayal feels like from the other side, the prophet essentially loaning out his own broken heart to illustrate a love that keeps forgiving long past the point any sensible person would have walked away. The drama extends even to the couple's children, who are given heavy symbolic names announcing the coming judgment, names that essentially meant not loved and not my people, walking sermons that the family had to carry around every day. And then, in the book's great turn, those very names get reversed, the not loved becoming loved, and the not my people becoming my people again, a small domestic picture of the largest promise in the whole story, that rejection was never meant to be the final word. Next comes a short book that unfolds against the backdrop of a devastating locust swarm, an ecological catastrophe so total that the prophet uses it to introduce a concept that will echo through this whole section, an approaching reckoning he calls the Day of the Lord. The locusts themselves are described in almost military terms, an unstoppable advancing army that strips the land bare and leaves nothing behind. And the prophet holds up that natural disaster as a small preview of the far larger day of reckoning on the horizon. The idea is a coming moment of decisive divine intervention, a day of judgment and setting things right that hangs over the horizon of many of these books. But this same short book also contains a glorious promise that a day was coming when God would pour out his own spirit on all kinds of people, young and old, men and women, regardless of status or rank, an outpouring that later readers would connect directly to a pivotal moment still far ahead in the story, when that promise would suddenly and dramatically come true in a way nobody expected. Then a herdsman turned prophet steps forward with one of the angriest and most socially pointed messages in the whole collection, and his target is injustice. He thunders against the wealthy and comfortable who trample the poor, who cheat in the marketplace, who live in luxury while their neighbours go hungry, and who then have the nerve to show up to religious ceremonies as if going through the motions of worship could paper over how they treat vulnerable people. His message is blunt and still stings today, that God has no interest in impressive religious performance from people who ignore justice, and that empty ritual is not just useless but offensive when it coexists with the mistreatment of the powerless. He opens cleverly too, working the crowd by pronouncing judgment on all the surrounding foreign nations first, which his audience would have cheered right along with, before abruptly turning the spotlight onto his own listeners and delivering the harshest verdict of all, a rhetorical trap that must have landed like a slap. One of his sharpest images is a plumb line, the simple weighted string a builder uses to check whether a wall is standing straight, held up against the nation to reveal just how far out of true it had leaned. It's a book that refuses to let religion become a substitute for basic decency, and famously insists that what God actually wants is for justice to roll down like a river and righteousness like an unfailing stream. The shortest book in the entire Old Testament follows, so brief you could read it in the time it takes to make a cup of coffee, and it's aimed at a single neighbouring nation. This neighbour had a long, bitter family history with the prophet's people, and rather than helping when the city fell, they had stood by gloating and even profiting from the disaster. The feud actually traced all the way back to those two struggling brothers from the early days of the story, the schemer and the one he cheated, whose descendants became these two rival nations, which means the grudge had been simmering for a genuinely absurd number of generations. The book is a compact verdict against that kind of cruelty, the particular ugliness of kicking someone when they're down, and a warning that those who celebrate another's downfall tend to find the tables turned on them. Then comes the one everyone remembers, and it's the closest thing the prophetic section has to a comedy, because its main character is a prophet who wants absolutely nothing to do with his assignment. Told to go warn a great and notoriously brutal enemy city that judgment was coming, he responds by immediately bolting in the exact opposite direction and boarding a ship to flee as far away as physically possible, which is a bold strategy for someone trying to escape an all-seeing God. A violent storm forces the issue, he ends up thrown overboard, and he's famously swallowed by an enormous fish, spending 3 memorably unpleasant days inside it before being deposited, presumably very grateful and very smelly, back on dry land. There's a lovely irony in that opening storm too, because the pagan sailors on the ship behave far better than the prophet does, desperately trying to save him and praying to a god they don't even know, while the supposed man of faith is snoring below deck trying to nap through the crisis. Given a second chance, he grudgingly delivers his warning, and then something happens that he absolutely did not want. The wicked enemy city actually listens, repents, and is spared, and instead of celebrating the most successful prophetic mission on record, he sulks, furious that God showed mercy to people he considered enemies. The book's final scene is quietly brilliant. The prophet sits outside the city hoping to watch it get destroyed anyway. A plant grows to shade him. He loves the plant. A worm kills the plant, and he's more upset about losing a bit of shade than about the fate of an entire city full of people. God gently points out the absurdity, that the prophet cared more for a plant he did nothing to grow than for thousands of human beings. And then the book simply ends on that unanswered question, leaving the reader to sit with it. It's a pointed little masterpiece about the scandal of divine mercy reaching people we'd rather see punished, and its hero is the only prophet in the collection whose main flaw is being too good at a job he hates. A book of both judgment and soaring hope comes next, and while it warns of coming consequences like its neighbours, it's most treasured for a single, startlingly specific prediction. It names the tiny, unremarkable town from which a future ruler would emerge, a leader who would shepherd the people and whose origins stretched back to ancient days. Pinpointing an obscure little village as the birthplace of a coming king, centuries before the fact, is the kind of detail that later readers would return to again and again, another one of those signposts planted far in advance. This same book also distills the whole message of the prophets into a single famous summary, cutting through all the ritual and religious machinery to state plainly what God actually requires of a person, which is to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. It's about as clear and portable a statement of the entire prophetic vision as anyone has ever managed. 3 simple demands that turn out to be a lifetime's work. Then, in what amounts to a sequel to that reluctant prophet's story, another book returns to the very same brutal enemy city, roughly a century later. The repentance from before had long since worn off. The city had gone right back to its cruelty, and this time there's no reprieve on offer. The book is a vivid description of that violent empire finally facing the judgment it had escaped before, a reminder that mercy delayed is not mercy guaranteed forever, and that a nation which builds itself on terror eventually runs out of road. Read alongside that earlier comedy of the runaway prophet, it forms a striking pair, the 2 books bookending the same city's story. One shows a brutal power given a second chance and taking it. The other shows what happens generations later when that grace is thoroughly squandered. Together they make the point that divine patience is real and generous, but not infinite, and that no empire, however fearsome, is too big to fall. The next voice does something refreshingly honest that a lot of readers connect with instantly. Rather than delivering a message to the people, this prophet turns and directs his complaints straight at God, wrestling openly with the oldest and hardest question there is. Why do the wicked seem to prosper while the righteous suffer, and why does God appear to do nothing about it? He's not being rebellious so much as painfully sincere, demanding to understand how a just God can tolerate so much injustice. Rather than storming off, he does something patient and dignified. He climbs up to a watchtower, metaphorically speaking, and resolves to wait for an answer, determined to stand watch until he hears back, rather than assuming silence means abandonment. The reply he eventually receives includes a line that would echo through everything that came after. The idea that the righteous person will live by faith, by steady trust, rather than by having every question resolved. And the book's resolution is one of the most quietly moving in the collection, because it doesn't come through a tidy answer to the question. It comes through a decision to trust anyway. The prophet arrives at a place where he declares that even if everything falls apart, even if the crops fail and the flocks vanish and there's nothing left, he will still choose to find his joy in God. It's faith not as certainty, but as a deliberate choice made in the dark, which is arguably the only kind that really counts. A short book follows that returns to that theme of a coming day of reckoning we encountered earlier, painting it in stark terms, but it doesn't end in gloom. Threaded through the warnings is the recurring promise of a remnant, a preserved group of the humble and faithful who would survive the judgment and be gathered up, God rejoicing over them like someone singing with delight. That image is worth pausing on, because it flips the usual direction of worship. We tend to picture people singing to God, but here it's God singing over his people, quietly overjoyed at the faithful few he's carried through the storm, which is a tender note to find in a book otherwise full of thunder. It's the reassurance that judgment was never the final word, that a faithful few would always be carried through to the other side. The final 3 books shift into the period after the return from exile, that stage we watched get set earlier, and they address a community that had made it home but lost its momentum. The first is essentially a motivational nudge with a pointed edge. The returned exiles had gotten comfortable building and decorating their own houses, while the rebuilding of the temple sat abandoned and half-finished, their priorities quietly inverted. This brief book calls them out on it, gently but firmly asking why they were lavishing attention on their own panelled homes, while God's house lay in ruins, and urging them to get their priorities back in order and finish the work. It also offers a striking encouragement to those disheartened old-timers who kept comparing the modest new temple unfavourably to the grand old one, promising that the glory of this later house would somehow come to exceed the former, a hint that something greater than fine architecture was going to fill it one day. It's a surprisingly relatable message about how easy it is to let the important things slide while we tend to our own comforts. The second of these post-return books is a wild ride of vivid, symbol-packed visions, dense with strange imagery and layered meaning, and it's especially rich in forward-looking glimpses of the promised one. Among its images is a memorable picture of a coming king arriving not on a warhorse in the manner of a conquering general, but humbly, gently, riding on a donkey, an image of a very different kind of ruler than anyone was expecting. That single detail, a king of peace on a lowly animal rather than a warlord on a steed, would turn out to matter enormously later on. The book is scattered with other forward-looking fragments that later readers found uncanny, including a shepherd figure valued and sold for a specific paltry sum of silver, and a mysterious mention of a people one day looking upon someone they had pierced and mourning for him. Read in advance, these are just strange, vivid images floating in a dense sea of visions. Read in hindsight, they became some of the most pored-over lines in the whole collection, and then the entire first half of the collection reaches its final page with a book that reads almost like a tense argument. It presents a back-and-forth dispute between God and a jaded, spiritually exhausted people who had settled into going through the motions, offering him their leftovers and second best, while quietly wondering whether any of it was worth the trouble. The book captures them responding to every charge with a kind of wounded innocence, essentially asking who, us, as though the evidence weren't sitting right in front of everyone. The disputes get specific and a little uncomfortable. They were bringing sick and blemished animals to offer, the ones they couldn't sell anyway, and acting offended when told this was insulting. They were neglecting their commitments and shortchanging what they owed, then wondering aloud why things weren't going well for them. It's the portrait of a relationship gone cold, not through dramatic rebellion, but through slow, cynical drift, which is arguably sadder. But even this last weary book ends by casting its eyes forward, promising that before the great day arrived, God would send a messenger to prepare the way, a figure in the spirit of that fiery prophet from the days of the kings, someone who would come to ready people's hearts for what was about to happen. It also promises that for those who honoured God, a sun of righteousness would rise with healing in its rays, a warm image of dawn breaking after a very long night. And with that promise hanging in the air, a promise of a coming messenger, and the arrival he would announce, the old collection simply stops. The pen lifts from the page, and what follows is not the next chapter, but something no one quite expected. A long, ringing silence, centuries of it, before the story would finally dramatically pick back up. It's a strange place to leave things, honestly, right in the middle of a sentence of anticipation, like a series ending on a cliffhanger and then going off the air for what must have felt like forever. But that silence wasn't empty. Behind the scenes, across those quiet centuries, the world was being rearranged in dramatic ways, empires rising and falling, languages spreading, roads being built, the whole stage being quietly reset for the entrance everyone had been promised. The prophets had done their work. They had warned, they had wept, they had pointed forward again and again to a rescuer, a suffering servant, a humble king, a child from a small town, a messenger to prepare the way. Every signpost had been planted. And now, with the last prophetic voice fallen silent, all that remained was the waiting, and the question of what on earth had been happening during all those years the story chose not to narrate. So what exactly was happening during all those quiet years the collection declined to narrate? Quite a lot, as it turns out. The story may have gone silent, but history most certainly did not, and the roughly 4 centuries that passed between the final page of the old collection and the first page of the new one are among the most eventful in the entire region's history. This is the gap that transforms the world completely, so that when the curtain finally rises again, everything looks different. The players have changed, the language has changed, the ruling powers have changed, and a whole set of new political and religious factions have appeared that will populate the next section of the story. Skip this stretch, and the world of the coming chapters seems to materialize out of nowhere. Understand it, and you'll grasp exactly why that world was wound as tight as a spring, ready to snap. When we left the story, the region was under the control of that relatively tolerant Persian Empire, the one whose emperor had generously sent the exiles home. That arrangement, comfortable as it was, did not last. A young military commander from the Greek world came storming out of the west and proceeded to conquer very nearly everything he laid eyes on, one of the most astonishing military careers in all of human history. By his early 30s, he had toppled the mighty Persian Empire entirely and carved out a realm stretching across 3 continents, an accomplishment that tends to make everyone else's resume look a little thin. Around the year 332 before the Common Era, his conquests swept through the small strip of land at the centre of our story, folding it into his enormous new Greek-speaking domain, and then, in a twist that would reshape everything, he died young, in his early 30s, having apparently run out of world to conquer, leaving behind an empire far too large for anyone to hold together. There's a grim little irony in a man conquering 3 continents, and then being undone not by an enemy army but by a fever in a palace. But ancient history is full of exactly that kind of anticlimax, and the greatest conquerors rarely got the dramatic battlefield endings the movies would give them. But his lasting impact wasn't the empire, which fell apart almost immediately. It was the culture he spread everywhere he went, a deliberate program of promoting Greek language, Greek customs, Greek architecture, Greek philosophy, and the Greek way of life across all the lands he'd taken. New cities were founded on the Greek model, complete with theatres, marketplaces and training grounds, and the local elites everywhere quickly learned that adopting Greek ways was the fastest route to getting ahead under the new management. This process of soaking the ancient world in Greek culture had enormous consequences, and one of them mattered more than all the rest combined. A common form of the Greek language became the shared tongue of the whole Eastern Mediterranean. The language traders, officials, and ordinary people could all use to communicate across old ethnic boundaries. Hold on to that detail, because a single shared language across an entire region will turn out to be one of the most important stage props in the entire story, the reason a message could later travel from one end of the map to the other without needing translation at every border. With the great conqueror dead and childless, his top generals did what ambitious military men tend to do when there's an ownerless empire lying around, which is fight over the pieces for the next several decades. When the dust settled, the little land at the centre of our story found itself wedged uncomfortably between 2 of the resulting rival kingdoms, one ruling from the direction of Egypt to the south, and one ruling from the direction of Syria to the north. For a long stretch it got passed back and forth between them, like an unlucky property caught between 2 landlords who each insisted it was theirs, changing hands through a series of wars that the local people had very little say in and even less enthusiasm for. The early period under the Southern Kingdom was relatively gentle, allowing the people considerable freedom to run their own religious affairs, which is roughly the best you can hope for when you're a small nation wedged between giants. The trouble came when control shifted north, to a dynasty that took a far more aggressive interest in stamping its culture onto everyone it ruled. Living on contested ground between 2 squabbling superpowers is, as anyone from such a region throughout history could tell you, a deeply exhausting way to exist, a bit like being the lawn 2 feuding neighbours keep trampling as they argue over the property line. Eventually the Northern Kingdom won control, and that's where things turned genuinely ugly, thanks to one particular ruler who's gone down in history as a first-class villain. This king gave himself the grand title Epiphanes, which announced to the world that he considered himself a god made visible in human form, the sort of self-description that tells you everything you need to know about a person's humility. His critics, showing that ancient people had a fine sense of humour, reportedly tweaked the nickname to something meaning the madman instead, which qualifies as some genuinely sharp commentary for the era. Around the year 167 before the Common Era, this ruler decided that the stubborn insistence of the people on keeping their own distinct religion and customs was an obstacle to his grand vision of a uniformly Greek empire, and he moved to crush it. He outlawed the people's traditional practices, banning their ancient customs on pain of death, and ordering their sacred scrolls destroyed, a systematic attempt to erase a culture rather than merely tax it. To be fair, some among the wealthy and ambitious had already been eagerly adopting Greek ways of their own accord, building Greek-style training grounds and quietly abandoning the old traditions to fit in with the fashionable new order, so the ruler wasn't working entirely against the grain. But for the majority who held their faith dear, his campaign was intolerable, and in the ultimate insult he marched into their sacred temple, the heart of their entire national and religious identity, and defiled it by turning it over to the worship of a foreign god, reportedly sacrificing an unclean animal on the holy altar, a deliberate desecration calculated to wound as deeply as possible. For a people whose whole story revolved around that temple, as the place their god dwelled among them, it was about the most devastating provocation imaginable. The response was a revolt, and it's a genuinely stirring underdog story. A rural priestly family refusing to comply sparked an armed uprising against the vast professional army of the empire, led by a son whose nickname translates roughly to the hammer, a name that leaves very little to the imagination. This ragtag rebellion used guerrilla tactics, knowledge of the local terrain, and sheer determination to do what should have been impossible, wearing down a superpower and eventually reclaiming their defiled temple. The odds were laughable on paper. A handful of rural fighters with improvised weapons against the disciplined phalanxes and war elephants of a Greek empire is not a matchup any reasonable bookmaker would take. And yet the rebels kept winning, ambushing larger forces in narrow mountain passes and refusing to fight the kind of open-pitched battles where the empire's superior numbers would crush them. It took years, and the cost was heavy, but persistence and home field advantage gradually turned the tide. They cleansed it and rededicated it to its proper purpose, and that joyful rededication is the origin of a festival still celebrated today, a wintertime holiday of lights commemorating the moment the sacred space was won back and restored. It's a rare bright spot in this long stretch of foreign domination, a moment when the small and the faithful got the better of the mighty and the arrogant. The victorious family didn't stop at winning the temple back. They established their own ruling dynasty and enjoyed a period of hard-won independence, the first the people had known in centuries. Unfortunately, as tends to happen, a family that comes to power through righteous rebellion doesn't always stay righteous once it has the power, and this dynasty eventually descended into the familiar spiral of court intrigue, ambition, and infighting, squabbling over the throne in ways that weakened the whole enterprise. The very family that had risen up to defend the purity of the faith gradually became worldly rulers like any other, combining the kingship and the high priesthood in ways that made a lot of devout people deeply uncomfortable, and eventually two rival brothers were so busy fighting each other for control that they each independently appealed to a rising outside power to settle the dispute. Inviting a superpower to referee your family squabble is, historically, a spectacularly bad idea, and it went about as well as you'd expect. Their independence, sweet as it was, came with an expiration date, and the family's internal power struggles ended up practically handing the region to the next great power waiting in the wings. That next power was Rome, and Rome did not do things by halves. In the year 63 before the Common Era, a Roman general named Pompey marched into the region, took control of the capital, and brought the brief experiment in independence to a decisive end. From this point on, the people lived under the shadow of the greatest empire the ancient world had yet produced, a machine of roads, taxes, and legions that stretched across the known world. Rome preferred to rule troublesome territories through local strongmen rather than governing every corner directly, and the man they eventually installed to manage this particular region was a ruler history remembers as Herod the Great. The arrangement suited Rome perfectly. A cooperative local king kept the peace, collected the taxes, and absorbed the population's resentment, while Rome enjoyed the revenue without the day-to-day headache of administration, stepping in directly only when things got out of hand. The title Herod carried deserves some scrutiny. He was great in the sense of being a spectacularly ambitious builder, responsible for enormous construction projects including fortresses, entire planned cities, and a massive and breathtaking expansion of the very temple at the heart of the nation, transforming it into one of the wonders of the ancient world, a gleaming complex that took decades to complete. He was considerably less great in the department of not murdering his own family members, an activity he pursued with alarming frequency whenever he suspected anyone, including his own wife and several of his sons, of eyeing his throne. His suspicion was so notorious that it was grimly joked it would be safer to be one of his farm animals than one of his sons, given the survival rates involved. Paranoid, brutal, and endlessly suspicious, he kept his grip on power through fear, and his reign forms the immediate backdrop to the events that open the next section of the story. When he finally died, his kingdom was carved up among several of his surviving sons, none of whom inherited much of his talent along with their share, and the resulting patchwork of squabbling minor rulers and direct Roman governors created exactly the kind of unstable, resentful, heavily policed environment in which the coming events would unfold. Some regions ended up managed by these lesser Herods, others fell under the control of Roman officials sent to keep order and collect revenue, and the whole arrangement simmered with tension. It's worth holding on to this messy political map, because the various rulers and governors who appear in the next section aren't random names. They're the direct products of this fractured inheritance. While all these armies and empires marched back and forth, something quieter but equally important was happening within the community itself, because these centuries of pressure and foreign domination forced the people to figure out how to hold on to their identity under constant threat, and out of that struggle emerged the religious factions that dominate the next part of the story. One group became fiercely devoted to studying and meticulously observing every detail of the ancient law, building elaborate systems of additional rules designed to keep people from accidentally breaking the original ones, and they became genuinely popular with the ordinary population. Another group, drawn largely from the wealthy priestly aristocracy, focused on the temple and its rituals, took a more limited view of which sacred writings counted, and tended to cooperate comfortably with whatever foreign power happened to be in charge, since cooperation kept them near the top. A third group grew so disgusted with what they saw as corruption in the temple establishment that they withdrew from society altogether, forming isolated communities in the wilderness to live in strict purity while awaiting a decisive intervention. And it's very likely that this separatist movement is connected to those very scrolls that later turned up preserved in desert caves. Beyond these three, the pressure of occupation also bred more openly political currents, including a fiercely nationalist strain that believed the only proper response to foreign rule was armed resistance, and would eventually help push the nation into a catastrophic war with Rome. Understanding these factions matters enormously for what comes next, because they aren't just historical background. The strict rule keepers, the aristocratic temple party, and the various nationalists are the very groups the central figure of the coming story would repeatedly clash with, and knowing where each one stood, what each one wanted, and why each one felt threatened turns those confrontations from confusing arguments into the high-stakes collisions they actually were. It was also during these centuries that a whole body of new writing flourished. Histories of the Great Revolt, collections of wisdom, and especially a wave of dramatic, symbol-heavy literature imagining how God would finally break into history to set things right. This kind of writing, full of visions, cosmic conflict, and coded imagery, fed a growing and increasingly feverish hope that the decisive moment couldn't be far off. The longer the occupation dragged on, the more intensely people scanned their scriptures and their skies for signs that deliverance was near, and that mounting anticipation is a big part of why the eventual arrival landed with such force. Something else took root during this period that would prove enormously important: a new kind of local institution. Since the temple was in a single location, and most people lived scattered far from it, communities began establishing local gathering places where they could assemble to read the sacred writings, pray, and learn together, effectively a neighborhood branch for a faith whose headquarters was often too distant to visit. These local meeting houses spread everywhere the people settled, and they became the everyday backbone of religious life, the places where the coming message would later find some of its first audiences. This was a genuinely significant development, because it shifted the center of gravity of the faith. For centuries, everything had orbited around a single building in a single city, but now, wherever even a small community existed, there was a place to gather, read, pray, and teach, which meant the faith could survive and even thrive far from its geographic heart. A religion that can be practiced anywhere without depending on one irreplaceable location is a religion built to travel, and that portability would matter enormously the moment the message needed to spread. And speaking of that scattering, by now communities of these people had spread throughout the Greek-speaking world, many of them so thoroughly immersed in Greek culture that they could no longer read their own scriptures in the original tongue. So a monumental translation project was undertaken, rendering the entire old collection into Common Greek, a version that allowed the scattered communities to keep reading their sacred texts and, almost as a side effect, made the whole story of the one God accessible for the very first time to the vast Greek-speaking population of the ancient world. According to a popular tradition, the translation was produced by a team of around 70 scholars, which is why the version came to be known by a name derived from that number, and whether or not the legend is accurate, the point stands that a huge and careful effort went into making these texts portable. The message was quietly being made portable in another sense too, translated into the one language nearly everyone could read, just waiting for the moment it would need to travel. It's genuinely striking, looking back, how much groundwork was laid during a period the collection itself doesn't say a word about. The silence, it turns out, was anything but idle. Take a step back and look at the stage that all these centuries had set, because it's remarkable how every piece was in position. There was a single common language spread across the whole region, so a message could travel without stopping for translation. There was a vast network of Roman roads and relative Roman peace, so people could actually move along those routes in safety. This was no small thing. Rome, for all its brutality, had imposed a level of order across the Mediterranean that made long-distance travel genuinely feasible for the first time on such a scale, with well-engineered roads reaching into distant provinces and the sea largely cleared of the pirates who had once made it treacherous. A traveller could, in principle, set out from one corner of the empire and reach the far side using a single currency, a shared language, and roads maintained by the state, which is a remarkably convenient arrangement for anyone who might, hypothetically, want to spread a message quickly across an entire civilization. There were local gathering houses scattered everywhere, ready-made venues for a new teaching. There were scattered communities primed by their sacred writings to be listening for something. And above all, there was a people living under the heavy boot of foreign occupation, taxed, humiliated, and aching for the promised deliverer their prophets had spoken of, straining toward the horizon for any sign of him. Their expectation, though, had curdled into something very specific. Centuries of being conquered had convinced most of them that the rescuer they awaited would be a warrior king, a military liberator who would raise an army, throw off the Roman yoke, and restore the nation to glory by force. They were watching for a general on a war horse. This wasn't an unreasonable reading of their own scriptures, which really did promise a coming king from the great shepherd king's line, and after generations of humiliation the longing for a conquering hero who would break the occupier's grip was entirely understandable. The problem was that they had fixed on one thread of the old promises, the royal conqueror, while quietly overlooking another that had been running right alongside it all along, the strange image from the prophets of a servant who saves not by fighting, but by suffering. And the story, as it had done so many times before, was preparing to arrive in a form almost nobody was expecting, onto a stage that had been stretched about as tight as a stage could be. Into exactly that world, after 4 centuries of silence, the story finally resumed. And when it resumed, it did so in an unusual way, not with a single account picking up the thread, but with 4 separate ones, each telling the story of the same central figure from its own distinct angle. After 4 centuries in which the collection had said nothing at all, this sudden abundance is almost jarring, like a broadcast that cut out for a very long time and then came roaring back on 4 channels at once, all covering the same breaking story. Think of it like 4 camera operators positioned around the same extraordinary event, each capturing the life, the death, and the return of one man, but each focused on different details and shooting for a different audience. This sometimes confuses people, who wonder why there are 4 overlapping versions rather than one tidy official account, and occasionally assume the differences between them are contradictions. But it's better to understand them the way you'd understand 4 witnesses to the same event giving 4 statements. Each notices what matters most to them, each remembers different details, and only by putting all 4 together do you get a full, 3-dimensional picture rather than a flat one. One account emphasizes certain events, another arranges things differently, one includes long teachings, Another races through the action. They aren't in competition. They're complementary lenses trained on the single most influential life in human history. What's fascinating is how much they share and how much they diverge. All four converge tightly on the final stretch: the man's last days, his execution, and the discovery that the tomb was empty, devoting a strikingly large proportion of their pages to that single week, as if signalling that everything else was building toward it. But scattered across the earlier material, each preserves scenes and sayings the others leave out entirely, which is why reading all four rather than just one is a bit like getting a story from several friends who each remember the parts that struck them most. The overlaps reassure you it's the same event, the differences fill in the depth, and the fact that the four don't march in lockstep, that they preserve their own distinct memories and emphases, is arguably a point in their favour, since four witnesses whose accounts matched word for word would look less like honest testimony, and more like a story that had been coordinated in advance. It's worth noting too that all four are firmly rooted in the real world we've just spent so long describing, naming actual rulers, actual regions and actual customs of the period, anchoring their subject in verifiable time and place rather than the vague once upon a time of legend. They read like accounts of things that happened to real people in a specific corner of a specific empire, which is exactly what they claim to be. The first of these accounts was written with a very particular audience in mind, aimed squarely at readers steeped in the old scriptures, and its entire mission is to demonstrate that this man is the long-promised figure the prophets had been pointing toward all along. To that end, it quotes the ancient predictions more than any of the others, again and again pausing the narrative to note how some detail of the man's life lined up precisely with something written centuries earlier, essentially connecting the dots for a reader who knew those old texts by heart. It opens, fittingly, with a genealogy, tracing the man's lineage back through the great shepherd king and all the way to the founding father of the nation, immediately anchoring him in the family line the promise was supposed to run through. It's a genealogy with a few surprises tucked into it too, quietly including several women with complicated or scandalous reputations, among them that loyal foreign widow and the unlikely heroine who sheltered the scouts long ago, a subtle hint that this king's story would have room for outsiders, and the overlooked from the very first page. And it's cleverly structured, organised around 5 major blocks of teaching, a design many readers believe was meant to echo the 5 foundational books of the law that opened the whole collection, quietly presenting this man as a new authority on the level of the great lawgiver himself. The most famous of these teaching blocks is a lengthy address delivered on a hillside, which contains some of the best-known lines ever spoken, a series of surprising blessings for the poor and the meek and the merciful, along with a model prayer that countless people still recite today. This same account is the one that opens with visiting scholars from the East following a star to find a newborn king, a detail that sends the paranoid Herod we met earlier into a predictable panic, tying the whole story straight into the political backdrop of its own time. Throughout, the account keeps returning to a central theme it calls the Kingdom of Heaven, presenting its subject not merely as a teacher, but as the rightful king inaugurating a whole new kind of reign, one that operates by upside-down rules where the humble are exalted and the last come first. And it drives home its central claim with a recurring formula, pausing again and again to observe that a given event happened in order to fulfill what had been spoken long ago, hammering the connection between this life and the ancient promises until no attentive reader could possibly miss it. The account closes with the man commissioning his followers to carry the message beyond their own people, to all the nations of the world, throwing the doors wide open. The second account takes almost the opposite approach, and it's the shortest and generally considered the earliest of the 4, written with a breathless urgency that you can feel on every page. Its favourite word is a term meaning immediately or at once, which it deploys so relentlessly that reading it can feel like being hurried along by someone who is very late for an appointment and keeps insisting you keep up. Where the first account pauses for long discourses, this one has little patience for extended speeches, preferring to rush from one dramatic scene to the next, packing in miracles, confrontations and action at a sprinter's pace. It seems to have been written with a non-native audience in mind, likely readers in the imperial capital itself, since it pauses now and then to explain local customs and translate unfamiliar terms, the sort of helpful footnotes you add when you know your readers aren't from around here. There's a quiet significance too in whose mouth it places the clearest recognition of who the man truly is, giving that pivotal declaration not to a follower or a religious leader, but to a hardened foreign soldier standing at the foot of the execution, a detail that would have landed powerfully with an audience of outsiders. It presents its central figure less as a distant teacher, and more as a man constantly on the move, serving and suffering, and in doing so it leans into that ancient image of the servant who suffers on behalf of others that we encountered back among the prophets. It's also refreshingly, almost brutally honest about the man's closest followers, who come across as a group that consistently misunderstands what's happening, argues about who among them is the most important, and abandons their leader when things get dangerous, which is not the flattering portrait you'd expect if someone was simply making the story up to look good. Running through the account is a curious pattern, where the man repeatedly tells people to keep quiet about who he is, as though the full truth couldn't be understood until the very end, a kind of held breath that only releases at the finish. Most striking of all is its ending, or rather its apparent lack of one. In its earliest form, the account seems to stop abruptly, right at the discovery of the empty tomb, with the first witnesses left stunned and afraid, and no tidy resolution offered. It's a jarring finish, and many think it's entirely deliberate, a storytelling choice that refuses to hand the reader a neat conclusion, and instead leaves them standing at the empty tomb, forced to decide for themselves what to make of it. The narrative essentially turns and asks the reader a direct question, then declines to answer it for them. The third account was composed by someone with the temperament of a careful investigator, widely understood to have been a physician by training, and it shows in the work, which is the longest, most detailed, and most methodically organised of the four. The author explicitly frames the project as an orderly account carefully researched from those who were there, the ancient equivalent of a thorough journalist checking the sources before publishing. This account has a particular tenderness toward the people society tended to overlook and push aside, lingering on the man's compassion for the poor, the sick, the outsiders, the foreigners, and the women who play a notably prominent role throughout, all the people a status-conscious culture preferred to ignore. It's fitting, then, that this is the account that gives us the beloved birth scene, in which the news of the child's arrival comes first, not to kings or priests, but to a group of lowly shepherds working the night shift in the fields, exactly the sort of unglamorous people the account loves to place at the centre. It also pays special attention to prayer, to joy, and to the role of God's own Spirit, and it strikes a warmer, more celebratory tone than the others, forever breaking into songs of praise at key moments. In keeping with its universal outlook, it traces the man's family line not merely back to the founding father of one nation, but all the way back to the very first human being, a deliberate signal that this good news was meant for the entire human family and not one ethnic group alone. And it's in this account, and only this account, that we find two of the most beloved and retold stories the man ever told, one about a despised foreigner who stops to help a wounded stranger everyone else walked past, and another about a reckless son who squanders everything, hits rock bottom, and is astonished to be welcomed home by a father who runs to embrace him. Both stories capture the account's whole heart, its insistence that mercy reaches further than anyone expects. This same author, notably, didn't stop at one volume, and would go on to write a sequel tracing what happened after, making him the closest thing the whole story has to a dedicated historian of the movement. The fourth account stands noticeably apart from the other three, written later and pitched in a completely different key, soaring and reflective where the others are grounded and narrative. It opens not with a birth or a genealogy, but with a breathtaking cosmic prologue that deliberately echoes the opening words of the entire collection, reaching all the way back to the very beginning of everything to present its central figure as the eternal divine word, present before creation itself. It's a staggering opening move, essentially claiming that the man whose earthly life the book is about to describe was there when the universe was spoken into being, a connection back to that very first page of the whole story that no attentive reader could miss. The account presents itself as resting on the memory of one particular close companion of the man, an eyewitness who describes himself only obliquely, and perhaps because of that first-hand closeness, it lingers on small, vivid, remembered details, the kind of specifics that tend to stick in the mind of someone who was actually there. This account contains not a single one of the parables the others are famous for. Instead, it's built around a careful architecture of 2 sevens. There are 7 remarkable demonstrations of power, presented not merely as miracles but as meaningful signs pointing to who the man truly is, from turning water into wine at a wedding to raising a friend from the dead. and there are 7 bold declarations in which the man describes himself using a specific formula beginning with the words, "I am," calling himself the bread of life, the light of the world, the good shepherd, the way, and so on, each one loaded with echoes of the divine name from the old scriptures. That formula is no accident, since those 2 simple words were exactly how God had identified himself from the burning bush all the way back in the story of the great rescue from Egypt. So every time the man uses them, an attentive reader steeped in the old texts would feel the ground shift. In place of the punchy parables and rapid scenes of the others, this account unfolds through long, searching conversations and extended reflections, slowing right down to sit with the meaning of things, and it grows especially intimate in its final stretch, preserving lengthy, tender words spoken to the man's closest friends on his last night with them. Where the earliest account leaves the resurrection as an open question, this final one presents it as the ultimate and crowning sign, and states its purpose with unusual directness, explaining that the whole thing was written precisely so that readers would come to believe. It's the most openly theological of the 4, less interested in simply reporting events than impressing their meaning. Taken together, these 4 accounts get anchored, in our running collection of Australian creatures, by the platypus, and honestly no other animal would do. The platypus is famous for being a biological impossibility, a creature that seems assembled from spare parts that have no business belonging to the same animal, a mammal that lays eggs, sports a bill like a duck, has webbed feet, and generally refuses to fit into any tidy category, leaving the scientists who first encountered it convinced it must be a hoax. That refusal to fit a category is exactly why it's perfect here. These 4 accounts are themselves a genre with no real precedent, blending biography, history, teaching, and theology into something that had never quite existed before. Not a straightforward life story, not a simple chronicle, but a new kind of writing altogether. And the figure at their centre is presented as an even greater impossibility, described throughout as somehow fully human and fully divine at the same time, a combination that breaks every category just as thoroughly as the platypus breaks the rules of the animal kingdom. Keep that improbable creature in mind because it captures the strange, unclassifiable heart of these 4 books, 4 angles on one life that together insist their subject was unlike anyone who had ever lived or ever would. The promised figure the whole enormous story had been building towards since that very first garden, finally stepping onto the stage. And there's a fitting symmetry in choosing the platypus for exactly this section, because just as the first naturalists to examine one were convinced someone was playing an elaborate joke on them, the central claim of these 4 accounts struck many who first heard it as equally impossible to accept, a report so surprising that the natural first reaction was disbelief. The books seem entirely aware of this. Rather than smoothing over how startling their claims are, they lean into the strangeness, essentially daring the reader to look at the evidence they lay out and decide for themselves whether something genuinely unprecedented had happened. The 4 accounts told the story of one remarkable life, and each of them closed with the same staggering claim about an empty tomb. But the story didn't stop there, because a life like that leaves consequences, and those consequences needed their own book. There's exactly one more work of history in the entire new collection, and it picks up precisely where the accounts left off, following what happened next when the movement its central figure had started was suddenly set loose on the world. It was written by that same careful investigator who produced the longest of the 4 accounts, the one with a physician's eye for detail, and it functions as a direct sequel, part 2 of a single project. But the sequel pulls off an unusual move right away by quietly swapping out its main character. The first volume starred the man himself. This one stars the invisible force he promised would arrive after him, which is a bold casting decision for a protagonist, and yet it works, because the whole point of the book is that the movement was never going to run on human effort alone. It opens with a scene that has to be one of the strangest job orientations in history. The man's followers, a frightened and rather unimpressive group who had mostly scattered when things got dangerous, are gathered together when the promised presence arrives in dramatic fashion, described as a rushing wind and what looked like tongues of fire settling on each of them. Suddenly this timid little band is transformed, and they spill out into the streets speaking in languages they'd never learned, so that a festival crowd drawn from every corner of the known world hears the message each in their own native tongue. If you remember that ancient episode where humanity's shared language got scrambled and everyone scattered in confusion, this is that moment run in reverse. the confusion of tongues briefly undone so that people from everywhere could understand a single message at once, a bit of tidy narrative bookkeeping across thousands of years. That day is treated as the birthday of the whole movement, and it grows explosively, thousands joining almost immediately, which is not bad for a group that had been hiding behind locked doors a few weeks earlier. The catalyst was a public speech by Peter, the very follower who had famously lost his nerve and denied even knowing his leader a few weeks before, now standing up in front of a massive crowd to explain what they were witnessing without a trace of his old cowardice. That turnaround, from a man who cracked under questioning by a servant girl to a man addressing thousands in the open, is itself a quiet advertisement for whatever had just happened to these people. Something had clearly changed them, and the sheer number of listeners who found the message compelling that same day set the pattern for everything to follow. The book is organised around a roadmap the man had laid out before departing, a simple expanding set of concentric circles. His followers were to spread the message starting in the capital city, then radiating out into the surrounding home region and the territory of a neighbouring people they'd long regarded with contempt, and finally reaching all the way to the far ends of the earth. And the book obligingly unfolds along exactly that widening path, the story pushing steadily outward from a single city to the whole Mediterranean world, like ripples moving out from a stone dropped in a pond. It's a satisfyingly clear structure for a book that otherwise covers a dizzying amount of ground. The early community it describes is a genuinely appealing picture, at least at first, a tight-knit group sharing their possessions, caring for the poor among them, and drawing crowds through both their generosity and a string of remarkable healings. The book is careful, though, not to paint them as flawless saints, including an uncomfortable episode where a couple lies about a donation to look more generous than they actually were, and suffers severe consequences, a pointed early warning that this new community was meant to run on honesty rather than performance. The original followers, meanwhile, are repeatedly hauled before the same council that had condemned their leader and ordered to stop speaking, and they repeatedly and politely decline, explaining that they simply couldn't stay quiet about what they'd seen, which is a brave stance for a group facing the exact authorities who'd recently executed the person they kept talking about. But it wasn't all warmth and miracles, because the religious authorities who had opposed the movement's founder were not thrilled to see it flourishing, and persecution followed quickly. The book doesn't flinch from this, recording the death of the first person killed for the message, a bold young man named Stephen, who was executed for his fearless testimony after delivering a sweeping speech retelling the entire national story and accusing the authorities of repeating their ancestors' worst mistakes, which, understandably, did not go over well with the authorities in question. It's a sobering early reminder that this was never a safe or comfortable movement to join, and yet the book immediately draws out an unexpected consequence, because the wave of persecution that followed scattered the believers out of the capital and into the surrounding regions, and instead of stamping out the message, this simply spread it further, the frightened refugees carrying it into every town they fled to. It's one of the book's quiet ironies that the very effort to crush the movement kept accidentally advancing it, a pattern that repeats so often it starts to look less like coincidence and more like a theme, and it's at that very execution that the book introduces the person who will dominate its second half, though at this point he's on the wrong side entirely. A zealous young enforcer named Saul stands approvingly by while Stephen is killed, and then throws himself into hunting down members of the movement with terrifying efficiency, dragging people from their homes and doing everything in his power to stamp the whole thing out. He was, without exaggeration, the movement's most dangerous enemy, which is what makes what happens next so extraordinary. On the road to a distant city, on his way to arrest yet more believers, he's stopped cold by a blinding encounter with the very figure he'd been persecuting, an experience so total that it flips his entire life inside out. The fiercest opponent becomes the most tireless advocate, a transformation so complete it's a bit like the leader of a hostile campaign suddenly showing up to run the opposition's operation, and under a slightly different form of his name, Paul, he becomes the central human figure of everything that follows. The switch was so abrupt that nobody quite trusted it at first. His former allies now wanted him dead as a traitor, while the believers he'd been hunting were understandably nervous about welcoming their most notorious persecutor to the meetings, leaving him briefly a man with no friends on either side. At one point he had to be smuggled out of a city under cover of darkness, lowered down the outer wall in a basket to escape those hunting him, which is a decidedly undignified start for the man who would become the movement's greatest voice, though it set the tone for a career full of narrow escapes. Another wall comes down when one of the original followers, Peter, is nudged through a strange vision toward the home of a Roman military officer, a foreigner and an outsider by every measure, and watches the same transforming presence fall on this non-native household just as it had on his own people. It was a pivotal, boundary-shattering moment, settling once and for all that this message was never meant to stay confined to one ethnic group, but was intended for absolutely everyone. A genuinely radical idea in a world obsessed with such divisions. And it's around this expanding, increasingly diverse movement that a brand new label first gets attached in the bustling city of Antioch, where the followers first came to be called by a name derived from their leader, a term that stuck and that we still use today. This flood of outsiders joining, however, forced an enormous question the movement couldn't dodge. Did these newcomers first have to adopt all the ancient customs and rules of the founding nation, or did they belong just as they were, on the basis of trust alone? The disagreement grew heated enough that the leaders convened a formal gathering in the capital to settle it, and after considerable debate they landed on the more radical answer, that the outsiders were full members without having to take on the entire old rulebook. It's easy to skim past this meeting, but it was one of the most consequential decisions in the whole book, the moment the movement chose to be a message for all of humanity, rather than a reform movement within a single nation, which is a large part of why it eventually spread as far as it did. From that same city, the reformed persecutor launches out on a series of 3 long missionary expeditions that form the backbone of the rest of the book, crisscrossing the Mediterranean world and planting new communities in city after city. These journeys are anything but smooth. He's beaten, jailed, run out of towns, caught in riots started by locals whose livelihoods his message threatened, and on one memorable occasion mistaken for a god by an enthusiastic crowd, a case of mistaken identity he found deeply horrifying and scrambled to correct. The specific incidents have a novelistic vividness to them. In one town, he and a companion are thrown into a cell after an earthquake conveniently rattles the doors open, and instead of fleeing they stay put to keep their terrified jailer from harming himself, winning him over in the process. In a sophisticated intellectual capital, he debates the local philosophers on their own turf, cleverly building his case around one of their own altars. And in another major city his message so threatens the lucrative trade in religious souvenirs that the local craftsmen, worried about their profit margins, whip up a full-scale riot in the town theatre, which is a very human reason to oppose a new idea. Through it all he keeps establishing churches and then writing back to them, a detail that becomes important very shortly. The sheer stubbornness of the man is remarkable, picking himself up after each disaster and moving on to the next city, apparently operating on the theory that getting stoned and left for dead in one town was simply a reason to go try the next one. The final stretch of the book follows his long, winding journey toward the empire's capital as a prisoner. Arrested on trumped-up charges, he cycles through a series of hearings before various Roman officials, none of whom can quite figure out what to do with him, since he keeps stubbornly refusing to be either obviously guilty or conveniently silent, and eventually exercises his right as a citizen to appeal his case directly to the emperor, which guarantees him a state-funded, if involuntary, trip to the heart of the empire. There's a certain dark comedy in watching a string of powerful governors and kings squirm through these hearings, several of them privately conceding he'd done nothing worth punishing, yet reluctant to release a prisoner who kept turning his own trial into a chance to explain his message to the very people judging him. The voyage is a catastrophe, including a spectacular shipwreck that leaves the whole party washed up on the island of Malta, where the local welcoming committee first assumes he must be a criminal getting his just deserts when a snake bites him, then does a complete reversal and decides he must be a god when he shrugs it off unharmed, a swing in public opinion that happened impressively fast. And then the book simply stops, which catches a lot of readers off guard. It ends with the great traveller under a loose form of house arrest in the capital, still freely welcoming visitors and explaining his message to anyone who will listen, with no account of his trial's outcome, no dramatic finale, nothing. It's an abrupt, almost unfinished ending, and many think it's entirely the point. The story of the movement, the book seems to suggest, doesn't actually have a tidy conclusion, because it was still being written, and in a sense still is, carried forward by everyone who picked up the thread after the last recorded page. The narrative essentially hands the reader the pen. This whole book of relentless forward motion gets anchored in our running collection of Australian creatures by the emu, a large, fast, flightless bird with one particularly fitting quirk. Because of the way its legs and joints are built, the emu physically cannot walk backward. It only goes forward. And that's the perfect image for a book about a message that kept advancing against every obstacle, through persecution and shipwreck and imprisonment, never once reversing, always pushing on to the next city, the next people, the next frontier. Every setback in the book, every arrest and beating and disaster, somehow becomes the launch point for the next leg forward, as if the whole thing were incapable of retreat. Keep that forward marching bird in mind, because it captures the strange momentum of a movement that spread precisely by being unable to stay still, turning every attempt to stop it into fresh ground gained. Now, remember that detail about the great traveller constantly writing back to the churches he founded. That habit produced something enormous, because a huge portion of the rest of the collection is made up of exactly that. Letters, actual pieces of correspondence sent to specific communities and individuals dealing with specific situations. There are 21 of them in total, and together they form a kind of instruction manual, not for what to believe in the abstract, but for how to actually live it out in the messy reality of real communities full of real, flawed people. This is worth keeping in mind as you read them, because these were never intended as tidy theological essays written for posterity. They were practical responses to actual crises, which means reading them can feel a bit like listening to one end of a phone call, catching passionate answers to questions you can only partly reconstruct. Someone was clearly in trouble, and someone else sat down to help. These letters were also genuinely precious objects to the communities that received them, hand-carried across long distances by trusted couriers, read aloud to the assembled group since most people couldn't read privately, and then copied and passed along to neighbouring churches who wanted to hear what advice their sister communities had been given. That's a large part of how they survived to become part of the collection at all, treasured and recopied by people who found them worth the considerable effort of preservation in an age before anything could be duplicated at the push of a button. The largest single share of these letters, 13 of them, come from that same tireless missionary, and they range from sweeping and systematic to urgent and deeply personal. The most comprehensive of them, addressed to the community in the imperial capital, is essentially his fullest and most orderly laying out of the whole message, the closest thing to a step-by-step argument he ever wrote. It walks through the case methodically, that every single person, respectable and disreputable alike, has fallen short and none can earn their way to a clean standing on their own merits, that being put right with God comes instead through trust rather than through flawless performance, and it builds to a soaring crescendo declaring that for those bound to the man, there remains no condemnation whatsoever, a chapter of pure assurance, the 8th that countless people have clung to in their darkest moments. That chapter closes with a sweeping insistence that nothing in all of creation, not hardship, not danger, not death, not anything above or below, could ever separate its readers from the love at the heart of the whole story, which is about as high a note as any piece of writing has ever tried to hit. 2 more letters went to a church in a notoriously rowdy port city, and they read like an exasperated troubleshooting session with a congregation that had managed to collect an almost impressive variety of problems. The members had split into rival factions cheering for their favourite leaders like sports fans. Some were behaving scandalously, others were hauling each other into court, and their gatherings had descended into chaos as everyone competed to show off their spiritual abilities. Into the middle of that mess, the writer inserts a passage on the nature of real love, describing it as patient, kind, not envious or boastful, that has become the single most quoted piece at weddings the world over, which is a wonderful irony given that it was originally fired at a bickering, self-important congregation as a corrective rather than composed for anyone's big romantic day. The same pair of letters also contains one of the most sustained explanations anywhere of why the resurrection matters so much, arguing bluntly that if the central claim about the empty tomb weren't true, the entire enterprise would be a waste of everyone's time, a refreshingly honest admission that the whole thing rises or falls on a single historical claim. A cluster of 4 letters were written from confinement, and they're conveniently rememberable as a little set, their names running in a tidy sequence you can lock in as a single memory hook. One is a fierce, almost furious defence of the idea that acceptance comes as a gift, and not as a wage earned by rule-keeping, aimed at communities being pressured to add a checklist of requirements. Another celebrates a sweeping vision of unity. Old hostilities dissolved so that former strangers become one family, and it includes a memorable image of the believer outfitted in a full set of protective armor for spiritual struggle. A third radiates a stubborn, almost defiant joy, all the more striking because its author was literally in chains as he wrote it, cheerfully insisting on gratitude and contentment from inside a prison cell. And the fourth exalts the supreme and total sufficiency of the man over every competing philosophy and spiritual fad on offer, of which the ancient world had no shortage. 2 shorter letters went to a young, anxious congregation preoccupied with the promised return of their leader, some of them so convinced it was imminent that they'd apparently quit working to sit around waiting, which the writer gently but firmly discourages. He also had to correct a piece of false teaching claiming that a long-anticipated day of reckoning, the very concept the ancient prophets had spoken of, had already come and gone, reassuring the worried readers that they hadn't missed anything and steering them away from both panic and idleness. It's a strikingly modern problem in its way. A community so fixated on an expected future event that they'd lost the ability to simply get on with their ordinary lives, and the advice is refreshingly grounded, essentially telling them to keep working, keep caring for one another, and stop obsessing over a timetable no one was given. Then there's a small set of practical letters written not to whole churches, but to individual leaders, coaching them on the unglamorous work of actually running a community, appointing trustworthy people, handling disputes, and keeping things healthy. The ancient equivalent of a management handbook for people who never asked to be managers, full of down-to-earth advice about avoiding pointless arguments and setting a good personal example. And tucked among them is a tiny, exquisite personal note, a delicate appeal to a slave owner asking him to take back a runaway who had since become a believer, not as recovered property but as a beloved brother and equal, a quiet little grenade of a letter that gently undermines the entire social order it was written into without ever raising its voice. It never issues a single command about abolishing anything. It simply reframes the relationship so thoroughly that the old arrangement quietly stops making sense, which is arguably a more disarming approach than any direct order. The remaining letters come from other leaders of the movement and tend to be addressed more broadly rather than to one specific church. The most elaborate of them is a sophisticated extended argument that the man surpasses everything that came before him, greater than the messengers of heaven, greater than the towering lawgiver of old, greater than the entire ancient priesthood, and it dwells at length on a mysterious, shadowy priest-king from the earliest days of the story, an obscure figure who had appeared for just a few verses back near the beginning, and is suddenly given fresh significance as a preview of a different permanent kind of priesthood. It also contains a stirring roll call in its 11th chapter, a parade of heroes from throughout the whole story, held up as examples of people who trusted the promise without living to see it fulfilled. A kind of hall of fame of faith that marches through name after familiar name, each one a link in the long chain of people who bet everything on a promise they only glimpsed from a distance. It's a fitting summary of the entire collection tucked into a single soaring chapter. Another letter is bracingly practical and a little blunt, insisting that genuine conviction has to show up in how you actually behave, rather than remaining a nice idea in your head, and it includes a memorable and slightly alarming meditation on how much damage the small, unruly human tongue can do, comparing it to a tiny spark capable of setting an entire forest ablaze. A pair of letters offer encouragement to people suffering for their beliefs, urging them to hold on to hope through hardship while keeping a wary eye out for con artists, peddling distorted versions of the message for profit. Another small group, warm and almost grandfatherly in tone, emphasizes the twin themes of living honestly in the light and loving one another in practice, boiling the whole thing down to the simple insistence that you can't claim to love God while treating the people around you badly, and warning against deceivers it bluntly labels enemies of the truth. And a short, fiery final one calls its readers to vigorously defend the authentic message against those twisting the idea of acceptance as a gift into a convenient excuse for behaving however they pleased, a misunderstanding as old as grace itself. These letters get anchored by a pair of appropriately spiky Australian lizards. The great missionary's own writings get the thorny devil, a small desert lizard absolutely covered in sharp spikes, which suits him perfectly because he could be genuinely prickly, quick to argue, unafraid of confrontation, and utterly unwilling to soften a hard truth, Yet underneath all those spikes beat one of the most fiercely loving and self-sacrificing hearts in the whole story, a man who repeatedly risked everything for people who often gave him grief in return. The rest of the general letters get the frilled lizard, the one famous for suddenly flaring out a dramatic, showy collar around its neck to make itself look impressive and get attention, which fits a set of letters that tend to be bold, attention-grabbing, and unafraid to make a big display of their point. There's a nice logic to the pairing too. The spiky little desert lizard captures a single towering personality, one intense man pouring himself into letter after letter, while the flashy collared one stands in for the more varied chorus of other voices, each making its own vivid, showy case in its own distinct style. Keep both little reptiles in mind, the spiky one and the flashy one, and the whole postal section of the collection stays neatly organised in your head, 21 letters reduced to 2 memorable lizards. Which brings us, at long last, to the final book, and it's a genuine spectacle, the most dramatic, most bewildering, and by far the most visually extravagant thing in the entire collection. A book that has launched countless feverish charts and an even larger number of confident end-of-the-world predictions, essentially all of which have aged poorly. It comes from a vision received by one of the movement's leaders, an old man exiled to a remote island for his beliefs, and its name simply means an unveiling, a pulling back of the curtain. And that's the key to reading it without losing your mind. Despite all the terrifying imagery, its fundamental purpose was to encourage battered, persecuted believers by pulling back the curtain on how the whole story ultimately ends, which is to say, extremely well. It's less a coded timetable of doom and more a reassurance, dressed in the wildest imagery imaginable, that no matter how bad things look, the outcome is already settled. It opens with an overwhelming vision of the risen central figure, now radiant and glorious, who dictates a series of 7 short pointed letters to 7 actual churches, each one a custom-tailored mix of praise, correction, and warning, and each ending with the same recurring drumbeat of encouragement, an urgent call to hold on and endure faithfully all the way to the finish. The letters are strikingly candid, reading like a series of frank performance reviews. Some congregations get commended for enduring hardship without giving up, others get scolded for growing lukewarm and complacent, and one memorably gets told that despite its glowing reputation for being alive and thriving, it was in reality spiritually dead, which is about as blunt an assessment as anyone could ask for. It's a reminder that this book, for all its cosmic scope, opens by addressing the ordinary, mixed, imperfect communities of real people who would first read it. Then the vision sweeps up into a dazzling heavenly throne room, a scene of blinding glory, at the centre of which sits a sealed scroll that no one in all creation is found worthy to open. And just as it seems no one can, a figure appears to take it, described in the most paradoxical terms in the whole book, a lamb that looks as though it has been slain, and yet is alive and triumphant. It's a stunning reversal of every expectation, the all-conquering hero of the cosmos turning out to be not a roaring lion but a wounded sacrificial lamb, victory achieved through surrender rather than force. That single image quietly rewires the entire meaning of power. The scene erupts into overwhelming worship, wave after wave of it. First the immediate attendants of the throne, then thousands upon thousands, then ultimately every living creature in existence joining a single swelling chorus. A picture of all creation finally united in acknowledging the one at the centre. For readers who were, at the time, a small and persecuted minority scattered through a hostile empire, this glimpse of where things were ultimately headed, of the whole cosmos on their side of the argument in the end, would have been almost unbearably reassuring. As the Lamb breaks the scroll's 7 seals, and then as 7 trumpets sound, and finally as 7 bowls are emptied out, waves of escalating catastrophe wash over the world in 3 intensifying cycles of judgment. It's worth understanding that these 3 sequences aren't necessarily meant to be read as one long, chronological checklist of events to tick off in order, which is the mistake behind most of those confident and repeatedly wrong end times charts. Many readers understand them instead as 3 overlapping retellings of the same period from different angles, each cycle circling back and intensifying, the way a piece of music might restate a theme louder and more urgently each time. Famous riders on horses go out across the earth, disasters strike the land, the sea and the sky, and the imagery grows steadily more overwhelming with each pass. Amid the chaos, a specific number of people, 144,000, are marked out and protected, a symbolic picture of God keeping his own safe through the storm rather than a literal head count. The cosmic conflict then takes centre stage with the appearance of a monstrous dragon, representing the ancient adversary who's been lurking since the very first pages, along with a terrifying beast rising to wield political power and a second deceiving figure performing false wonders to lead people astray. A great, corrupt, seductive world system, symbolically named after that infamous ancient empire that once burned the sacred city, rises in all its arrogance and then spectacularly collapses. For the book's first readers, this symbolic wicked city would have pointed unmistakably at the oppressive empire of their own day, the one persecuting them, and the vision of its downfall was a coded promise that no arrogant earthly power, however invincible it looked from ground level, was permanent or beyond judgment. It's the same reassurance the prophets had offered centuries earlier about the empires of their time, now dressed in far more vivid clothing. And then comes the turn everything has been building toward. The central figure returns, no longer a suffering servant but a conquering king, and decisively defeats the forces arrayed against him, with the beast and the false deceiver thrown into a lake of fire. A long reign of 1,000 years follows, and then history reaches its final courtroom, a last judgment in which the dead are raised and every life is honestly assessed. This is the sober moment the whole story has been quietly pointing toward, the insistence that actions matter and that the universe is ultimately answerable to justice rather than indifference. In the ultimate victory, the two oldest enemies of all, death itself and the shadowy realm of the dead, are finally and permanently destroyed, the last and most stubborn foes defeated for good. For a story that has wrestled with loss and grief on nearly every page, the abolition of death itself is the payoff the whole thing has been straining toward. But the judgment isn't the climax. The real climax, the destination, the entire enormous collection has been travelling toward since its very first sentence, is what comes after. A new heaven and a new earth appear, all the old brokenness swept away, and a radiant new city descends from above, coming down to earth rather than whisking people off somewhere else, so that God comes to make his home directly among his people once more. The vision describes him personally wiping away every tear from every eye, and declares that death will be no more, and neither will grief, or crying, or pain, because all the old sorrows have finally passed away for good. The description of that final city is deliberately lavish, gates that never close because there's no longer any threat to shut out, streets and walls of gold and precious stone, and no need for sun or moon because the presence of God himself provides all the light there is. Most telling of all, the vision points out that the city has no temple in it, which sounds strange until you realize why. For the entire story, the temple existed as the one special place where God and people could carefully meet across a distance. Now there's no need for a designated meeting spot, because the separation it was built to bridge is simply gone, and in a detail that should make anyone who's followed the whole story catch their breath, the tree of life reappears, the very tree from that first perfect garden all the way back at the beginning, lost when everything first went wrong, now restored and freely available, its leaves for the healing of the nations. Step back and take in the shape of the whole thing, because this ending is not just a happy conclusion, it's a homecoming. Cast your mind all the way back to that opening garden, where three things existed in perfect harmony: God present and close, his people at home and unashamed, and the good land flourishing around them. That harmony shattered almost immediately, and every single thing that followed, the whole vast sprawling story of wandering and slavery and kingdoms and exile and prophets, and one astonishing life, has in one way or another been about the long, aching effort to put those three things back together. And here, on the final page, it finally happens. God, his people and the place they share are reunited permanently, the ancient separation that began with an exit from a garden closed forever, with an entrance into a garden city. The story that opened in paradise closes in a restored paradise, except now it can never be lost again. The whole enormous circle finally connects, beginning and ending clasped together across more than 1,000 years of writing, and thousands more of history. And notice that the ending isn't merely a return to the start, a simple undoing of the damage as if the whole painful middle had never happened. It's the beginning fulfilled and expanded, a solitary garden grown into a vast shining city full of people from every nation. The original design not just restored but brought to a completion it never reached the first time around. The trouble, it turns out, was never the last word. It was the long, winding middle of a story that always knew where it was going, and that, in a few short hours, is the entire sweep of it. From a garden to a garden, from a promise whispered in the wreckage of the first disaster to that promise finally and completely kept. 66 books, dozens of writers, centuries of history, one continuous thread running through all of it, held together in your memory now by an unlikely parade of Australian animals. But here's the honest truth about everything we've just done together. This was only ever the map, the aerial view, the trailer for the actual thing. A summary can show you the shape of a story, but it can never replace the experience of walking through it yourself, lingering over the details, sitting with the parts that puzzle you, and discovering the countless moments no overview could ever fit in. Everything we covered tonight, every animal and every era, was really just a set of handles to grab onto, a scaffolding built so that when you finally step inside the real thing, you won't get lost. You'll know roughly where you are, which room you've wandered into, and how it connects to everything else. So consider this your send-off, not to sleep, but to something better. The real book is right there, and now you finally have the framework to make sense of it. Close this, open that, and go read it for yourself.